My 8-year-old adopted granddaughter was left entirely alone in a dark house, while my son and his wife took their biological child on a luxury Caribbean cruise. She called me at 2 in the morning, crying and asking why they did not wake her up. I booked last-minute tickets, and within 7 hours, we crashed their vacation. My name is James. I am 70 years old, and this is how I dismantled my son's empire. The shrill ringing of the telephone shattered the absolute silence of my bedroom. At exactly 2:30 in the morning, I sat up quickly, my 70-year-old joints protesting the sudden movement in the dark. I reached for the receiver, expecting the automated voice of my estate security company reporting a false alarm. Instead, a tiny and trembling voice echoed through the speaker. "Grandpa James," she whispered. The voice belonged to Zariah, my 8-year-old adopted granddaughter, and it was entirely soaked in terror. I asked her what was wrong and where her parents were. She sobbed quietly, her breath catching in her throat. She told me it was completely dark and she was hiding in the laundry room because the power went out during a storm. She said she tried to go to her brother Mason's room, but his bed was empty. She checked the master bedroom, but her parents were not there. She asked me again why they did not wake her up. My blood turned to absolute ice. My son Michael and his wife Heather had meticulously planned a 16-day luxury cruise through the Caribbean. They had talked about it for 6 months at every family dinner, boasting about the exclusive suites and private island excursions. They had explicitly promised me they hired a premium live-in nanny from a high-end agency to care for Zariah while they bonded with their biological son. I instructed her to stay exactly where she was. I told her I was leaving my house right now, and she needed to keep the phone to her ear. I promised I would be there in exactly 12 minutes. I did not panic. I moved with the cold precision of a man who spent 40 years managing supply chain crises across the country. I built a regional logistics empire from a single delivery van while facing the systemic racism of the corporate world in the 70s. I navigated ruthless union disputes and corporate warfare. I knew exactly how to handle a crisis. I grabbed my keys, walked out into the humid Florida night, and started the engine of my heavy-duty truck. I kept Zariah on the phone the entire drive, listening to her shaky breathing, while I spoke in a low and steady rhythm to keep her calm. I drove through the empty suburban streets, my mind processing the situation. Michael and Heather had bragged endlessly about this $20,000 vacation. Heather constantly complained about the emotional labor of raising an adopted black child, treating Zariah more like a charity prop for her social media than a daughter. She pushed Zariah aside the moment she gave birth to Mason, but abandoning an 8-year-old child was a new level of depravity. I arrived at their gated suburban mansion and bypassed the intercom. Using the emergency override code Michael assumed I had forgotten long ago. The massive house was pitch black. A severe thunderstorm had rolled through earlier, knocking out the neighborhood transformer. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and turned on my industrial flashlight. I called out Zariah's name, letting my deep voice resonate through the cavernous and silent foyer. I walked toward the back of the house, keeping the beam of light steady on the floor so I would not frighten her further. A small figure scrambled out from the hallway shadows and collided with my knees. I dropped the flashlight on the rug and scooped the little girl into my arms. She was shivering violently, wearing thin cotton pajamas. I rubbed her back and whispered that she was completely safe now. I carried her into the kitchen and placed my flashlight on the marble island to illuminate the room. There was a bright yellow sticky note resting against the stainless steel espresso machine. I picked it up and read the handwriting. It belonged to Heather. The note stated that the nanny canceled at the very last minute. It said they had to catch their early flight to Miami, or they would lose their non-refundable VIP deposit. Heather wrote that she left frozen meals in the freezer and instructed Zariah not to open the door for anyone. The note ended with a casual promise that they would be back in 16 days. I stared at the piece of paper in pure disbelief. They had not left her with a negligent teenager or a neighbor. They had intentionally abandoned a helpless 8-year-old child in a massive empty house just to catch a luxury vacation. They chose a tropical cruise over the safety of their daughter. I did not scream. I did not smash the expensive glass vase resting on the counter. Rage is a loud and useless emotion. I prefer absolute and calculated execution. I looked at my granddaughter wipe the tears from her cheeks and told her to go pack her favorite clothes. I told her she was coming to live with me. I did not call the police immediately. A single child endangerment charge can be easily fought and buried by highly paid defense lawyers. A rushed phone call to the authorities would only give Michael and Heather time to fabricate a story, hire a crisis management team, and hide their assets from the inevitable fallout. I needed to dismantle their entire foundation simultaneously. I packed Zariah into my truck and drove us back to my estate. While she slept peacefully in my secure guest room, I pulled out my reading glasses and opened my laptop. I accessed my private banking portal. Michael believed I lived entirely on my modest Social Security checks. He was completely ignorant of the blind corporate trust, holding the millions I accumulated before transferring the company operations to him. I checked the specific cruise line itinerary they had bragged about. Their luxury ship was scheduled to depart from Miami in just a few hours. I pulled out my platinum corporate card and booked 2 first-class flights to Miami. I also booked the most expensive royal penthouse suite available on that exact floating palace. I was going to crash their perfect vacation and watch the color drain from their arrogant faces. I did not leave a message for my son. Let them sail away thinking they got away with their crime. Let them drink their expensive champagne. The silent adjustment of their reality had officially begun. I carried Zariah through the heavy oak doors of my estate and settled her into the plush bedding of the guest room. She fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted from the sheer terror of being abandoned in the dark. I closed her door quietly and walked straight into my home office, entirely bypassing the need for sleep. I picked up my phone and dialed Thomas, a man who served as my chief corporate counsel for 3 decades. Thomas answered on the second ring, accustomed to my unorthodox hours. I ordered him to initiate an immediate stealth forensic audit of every single corporate account under my son's operational control. I built my logistics empire from a single rusty delivery van in the 1970s, navigating a corporate landscape actively designed to keep a black man from succeeding. I broke through systemic redlining, fought off vicious union disputes, and laid the foundation for a multi-million-dollar enterprise with my own blood and sweat. When my joints began to ache and my late wife begged me to slow down, I handed the title of Chief Executive Officer to Michael. I wanted him to have the head start I was violently denied. I gave him the keys to a polished, fully operational machine, believing he possessed the integrity to steer it. I was deeply mistaken. Thomas did not ask questions. He simply agreed and hung up, knowing my tone meant absolute warfare. I packed a single leather duffel bag, locked the estate doors behind me, and carried a sleeping Zariah out to my truck. The digital clock on the dashboard read 4 in the morning as I pulled out of the driveway and headed straight for the highway leading south toward the Miami port. The sun was just beginning to bleach the Florida sky when my phone buzzed through the truck audio system. I tapped the screen to answer, keeping my eyes fixed on the endless stretch of highway. Thomas had not even waited for standard business hours to dig into the ledgers. His voice was grim, stripped of all professional pleasantries. He informed me that the initial sweep of the expansion fund accounts revealed a massive and glaring anomaly. Just 48 hours prior, Michael had authorized a direct wire transfer of exactly $50,000 from a heavily restricted corporate development account into his personal checking account. The logistics firm required 2 signatures for any withdrawal of that magnitude. Thomas confirmed that Michael had blatantly forged my digital authorization to bypass the security protocol. He used stolen company capital to finance a luxury vacation while leaving my granddaughter to fend for herself with a pile of frozen dinners. The betrayal crystallized in my mind, shifting from severe negligence to outright felony embezzlement. My son was not just a terrible father. He was actively bleeding the legacy I built dry to fund his wife and her vanity. I instructed Thomas to document the digital footprint of the transfer, secure the IP addresses, and prepare a formal corporate injunction. I told him to hold the legal strike until I gave the absolute final signal. Thomas agreed, advising me to be careful, but I had moved far beyond the realm of caution. The truck engine roared as I accelerated toward the coast. Michael believed he had successfully outsmarted an old man and secured his perfect getaway. He failed to realize that stealing from a logistics expert meant I could track every single dollar right back to his exact location. We arrived at the bustling Miami terminal just as the massive oceanic majesty began boarding its priority guests. I bypassed the agonizingly long public lines and escorted Zariah directly to the VIP concierge desk, sliding my heavy platinum corporate card across the polished marble counter. Within 20 minutes, we were walking up the plush carpeted ramp and stepping into the dazzling sunlit atrium of the ship. The staff immediately fawned over Zariah, handing her a tropical fruit drink with a tiny umbrella and referring to her as a young princess. She beamed, looking around the towering glass elevators and sparkling chandeliers with wide, disbelieving eyes. It was a viciously stark contrast to the sheer neglect she endured in her own home. Heather had only adopted Zariah 3 years ago to serve as a convenient prop for her public image. She used my beautiful black granddaughter to secure a highly coveted seat on a prestigious diversity and inclusion charity board, parading Zariah around at fundraising galas in matching designer dresses. The moment the ink dried on the adoption papers and Heather miraculously became pregnant with her biological son, Mason Zariah was instantly discarded. She was banished to a small room at the back of the house, excluded from family photos, and treated as an invisible burden. Watching the ship's stewards treat her with genuine warmth only solidified my absolute resolve to destroy the people who had hurt her. I guided Zariah to our reserved royal penthouse, a sprawling suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic. I ordered a lavish room service breakfast for her and told her to enjoy the panoramic view. My duty as a grandfather was to protect her, but my duty as a father was to execute a severe reckoning. I left Zariah happily eating silver-dollar pancakes under the watchful eye of our dedicated suite butler and made my way down to the main promenade deck. I approached the chief guest services desk, a quiet and highly exclusive area reserved for top-tier passengers. I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my money clip and slid it seamlessly under a brochure, asking the sharply dressed concierge for a small favor regarding my family. I provided Michael and Heather's names, claiming I wanted to surprise them with a vintage bottle of champagne at dinner. The concierge smiled warmly, pocketed the bill with practiced discretion, and pulled up the ship internal passenger manifest on his terminal. He quickly verified their cabin number and confirmed their exact dining reservation for that afternoon. They were scheduled for a private seating in the Crystal Room, the most exclusive and strictly monitored restaurant on the entire vessel. I thanked the man, turned away from the desk, and walked slowly toward the grand staircase leading to the dining decks. The ship horn blew a massive vibrating note signaling our departure from the mainland. The ocean stretched out infinitely behind us, severing any chance Michael and Heather had of escaping what was coming. I adjusted my suit jacket, checked my watch, and walked straight toward the heavy glass doors of the VIP dining room, completely ready to shatter their pathetic illusion of a perfect and wealthy life. I held Zariah by the hand as we stepped through the heavy glass doors of the VIP dining room. The space was a masterpiece of oceanic luxury. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm and golden glow over the polished mahogany tables and the pristine white linen tablecloths. The room hummed with the quiet and expensive chatter of the ship elite passengers. I scanned the room with the practiced eye of a man who spent decades reading corporate boardrooms. It did not take me long to find them. Michael and Heather were seated at a large circular table directly in the center of the room. They were holding court with 3 other wealthy white couples. The table was littered with empty champagne flutes and half-eaten plates of imported caviar. Heather wore a shimmering silver evening gown that probably cost more than a reliable used car. She was leaning forward and waving a manicured hand in the air while aggressively complaining to the women seated next to her. Her voice carried over the soft background music of the string quartet. She loudly lamented the utterly exhausting emotional labor required to raise an adopted child. She told the attentive table that she and Michael had simply needed to prioritize their biological family to maintain their mental health. She claimed the absolute sacrifice of taking this exclusive vacation was necessary for their own survival. Michael sat beside her in a tailored tuxedo, swirling a fresh glass of expensive champagne and nodding in solemn agreement with his wife. He looked the part of a successful and stressed executive seeking a well-deserved sanctuary away from his heavy burdens. He looked exactly like a man who had not just committed felony child abandonment and massive corporate embezzlement. I did not shout or draw immediate attention to ourselves. I walked slowly and deliberately across the plush carpet, guiding Zariah right up to their lively table. The other couples noticed us first, their polite smiles faltering, as they took in the sight of a tall, older black man holding the hand of a little girl in a simple cotton sundress. Heather was still talking animatedly, completely oblivious to the sudden shift in the atmosphere around her. I pulled an empty chair away from the adjacent table and slid it directly next to Heather. I sat down smoothly and pulled Zariah onto my lap. Heather finally turned her head, her arrogant smile freezing instantly on her face. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as her brain struggled to process the impossibility of our physical presence on the ship. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. I told her that it truly takes an immense amount of sacrifice to leave an 8-year-old child entirely alone in the dark with nothing but a yellow sticky note. The silence that fell over the large table was absolute and suffocating. Heather opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the edge of the mahogany table and crashed onto the polished floor, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. The sharp noise echoed loudly across the quiet dining room, drawing the stares of every single wealthy passenger nearby. Zaria simply buried her face in my shoulder, ignoring the woman who had treated her like disposable garbage for 3 years. I did not blink, holding my gaze steady on my daughter-in-law as her entire fabricated reality began to violently crumble. Michael violently choked on his champagne, spraying the expensive liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. He coughed uncontrollably, his face turning an ashen and sickly shade of gray. He slammed his glass down and stared at me as if I were a literal ghost. He scrambled out of his chair and rushed around the table, his tailored tuxedo suddenly looking far too tight for his panicking frame. He leaned down and grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into my suit jacket. He hissed under his breath, desperately begging me to keep my voice down and stop making a public scene in front of his important new friends. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm and then stared directly back into his panicked eyes. I did not physically pull away or raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I simply told him to remove his hand from my person immediately. My tone carried the exact same heavy and unyielding authority I used to negotiate hostile labor strikes 40 years ago. Michael swallowed hard, his arrogant posture shrinking into absolute submission, and slowly pulled his hand back. The wealthy white couple seated at the table were now staring at us in pure horror. The elegant facade Michael and Heather had carefully constructed for them was completely obliterated. They had spent the entire afternoon listening to Heather portray herself as a martyred and exhausted mother of a difficult adopted child. Now they were watching an elderly grandfather confront them for abandoning that very child to fly to Miami. The thick and uncomfortable tension in the dining room was palpable. Michael stood awkwardly beside my chair, sweating profusely under the crystal lights, entirely powerless to control the narrative or force me to leave the room. Heather finally found her voice, though it lacked any of its previous melodic charm. She stood up abruptly, her expensive silver gown rustling, and desperately signaled for the dining room manager. She demanded that the waiter call ship's security immediately to have me physically escorted away from their private table. She frantically claimed I was aggressively harassing her family and making her important new friends incredibly uncomfortable. I did not move a single inch from my seat. I simply offered her a very cold and heavily calculating smile. The dining manager rushed over to our table looking incredibly anxious about the escalating situation among his highest-paying premium guests. Before the manager could even open his mouth to address me, I looked back at Heather and suggested she lower her voice and cancel her impending orders for more imported champagne. I calmly informed her that she should probably refrain from running up any further luxury charges on this extravagant vessel. I stated clearly and slowly that I had already instructed my corporate attorney, Thomas, to completely freeze every single corporate credit card currently carrying her name. I watched the absolute terror wash over her pale face as she finally understood I knew exactly how they had illegally funded this vacation. I told them both to enjoy their final peaceful dinner because their unearned access to my hard-earned wealth was permanently and entirely severed. I left the dining room with Zaria holding my hand closely and walked out onto the sunlit upper deck to get some fresh ocean air. I did not have to wait long before the heavy glass doors swung open behind us. Michael marched onto the deck with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He was absolutely furious, and his face was flushed bright red from the public embarrassment he had just endured in front of his wealthy new friends. He cornered me near the steel railing and lowered his voice into a vicious whisper. He accused me of completely losing my mind and stated that my behavior was highly erratic and totally unacceptable. He actually threatened to have me forcibly committed to a state-run nursing facility the very moment we returned to Florida, so I could no longer interfere with his perfect life. I did not raise my voice or react to his pathetic attempt at intimidation. I simply turned to face him and recited the exact sequence of numbers he thought he had hidden deep within the corporate ledger. I listed the highly secure routing number of the Restricted Corporate Expansion Fund. I gave him the precise date and time of the fraudulent transfer he authorized 48 hours ago. I then stated the exact amount of $50,000 he had illegally wired into his personal checking account using my forged digital signature. The arrogant threat of a nursing home died instantly in his throat. The flush drained completely from his face, leaving him pale and covered in a sudden layer of cold sweat. He stood there entirely speechless as the warm ocean breeze blew past us. He realized in that exact moment that I was not a confused old man but the architect of his impending destruction. Later that afternoon, I sat peacefully on the balcony of my penthouse, watching the endless blue horizon while the consequences of my phone call to Thomas began to detonate. Down on the promenade deck, Heather had decided to soothe her severely bruised ego by taking her biological son Mason to the highly exclusive luxury ship spa. She strutted up to the marble reception desk and booked a series of premium treatments totaling $800. She casually tossed her corporate platinum card onto the counter with her usual air of absolute superiority, while several other affluent passengers waited in line behind her. The spa attendant swiped the card through the terminal and frowned. The machine emitted a loud and sharp buzzing sound, indicating a hard rejection. Heather scoffed loudly and demanded the attendant try it again, claiming the ship systems were clearly defective and poorly managed. The attendant swiped it a second time and respectfully informed her that the card was completely declined by the issuing institution. Heather turned bright red as the wealthy women standing behind her began to whisper and stare at her embarrassment. Highly humiliated, she stepped aside and immediately dialed the primary concierge number for her corporate bank, expecting to scream at a customer service representative. Instead, she was connected directly to the strict fraud prevention department. The representative informed her in a very dry tone that her platinum card and all associated corporate accounts were entirely locked. The bank representative clearly stated that the accounts were frozen pending an active federal fraud investigation initiated by the primary account holder. Heather dropped her phone into her designer handbag and fled the luxury spa in absolute disgrace without looking back. Michael and Heather retreated to their cramped cabin, completely enraged and utterly humiliated by the sudden removal of their financial invincibility. They were backed into a corner, but their profound arrogance prevented them from simply surrendering and accepting their fate. They still believed I was just a tired old man who could be easily overpowered by legal intimidation and sheer audacity. They sat in their room and quickly formulated a desperate counterattack to regain control of the situation and remove me from the board entirely. Michael opened his travel briefcase and retrieved a specific stack of papers he had brought along for an entirely different sinister purpose regarding my future. He adjusted his tailored jacket and marched straight down to the lower decks to locate the primary office of the ship's security chief. Michael presented himself as a deeply concerned and heartbroken son dealing with a sudden family tragedy. He spoke to the chief of security with a perfectly rehearsed tone of sorrow and exhaustion. He explained that his elderly father had recently suffered a severe mental break and had kidnapped his young daughter in a state of deep senile delusion. Michael handed the security chief a heavily stamped and official-looking legal document to support his fabricated story. Hun demanded that the ship authorities step in immediately to secure the safety of his family and remove the dangerous element from the vessel before anyone was hurt. He believed his expensive corporate attire and his smooth executive vocabulary would easily convince the crew's staff to do his dirty work for him. He assumed a single piece of paper would be more than enough to permanently silence me. I was sitting in the plush living area of the royal penthouse reading a book to Zariah when a heavy and authoritative knock echoed against my cabin door. I instructed my granddaughter to stay comfortably on the sofa and walked over to open the door. 3 large men in crisp white maritime security uniforms stood in the hallway, looking incredibly tense and serious. The chief of security stepped forward and asked to confirm my identity. Once I nodded, he informed me with a stern voice that there had been a severe medical and legal complaint filed against me by my immediate family members. He politely but firmly asked me to begin packing my bags immediately, stating that I was required to disembark the vessel at the very next port of call under the direct authority of the ship captain. I looked at the 3 men and asked him exactly what legal grounds he had to order my sudden removal from the ship. The security chief pulled a folded document from his metal clipboard and held it up for me to read clearly. It was a formal medical power of attorney signed by Michael and a corrupt private physician declaring me legally and mentally incompetent due to advanced stages of dementia. The silent adjustment had just escalated into open and hostile warfare. I sat in the plush living area of the royal penthouse, gently reading a storybook to Zariah when a heavy and authoritative knock echoed against my cabin door. I instructed my granddaughter to stay comfortably on the sofa assuring her she was perfectly safe, and walked over to open the door. 3 large men wearing crisp white maritime security uniforms stood in the hallway looking incredibly tense and serious. The chief of security stepped forward and asked to officially confirm my identity. Once I nodded, he informed me with a stern voice that there had been a severe medical and legal complaint filed against me by my immediate family members. He politely but firmly asked me to begin packing my bags immediately, stating that I was required to disembark the vessel at the very next port of call under the direct authority of the ship captain. I looked at the 3 men and asked him exactly what legal grounds he had to order my sudden removal from the ship. The security chief pulled a folded document from his metal clipboard and held it up for me to read clearly. It was a formal medical power of attorney. He explained that my son Michael had reported that I recently suffered a severe mental break and kidnapped my young granddaughter in a state of deep senile delusion. The chief declared that this document proved I was legally and mentally incompetent due to advanced stages of dementia, giving Michael full authority over my movements. I did not raise my voice and I did not show a single ounce of panic. I simply walked back to the dining table, picked up my black coffee, and took a slow, deliberate sip while the security officers watched me in utter confusion. I placed my coffee mug down on the polished table and calmly opened my laptop. I did not waste my breath arguing with the maritime security team. Instead, I initiated a secure video call directly to Thomas, who was already sitting at his desk, anticipating my next strategic move. When Thomas appeared on the screen, I turned the laptop around so the chief of security could clearly see his face. Thomas formally identified himself as the chief corporate counsel and primary estate attorney for my entire logistics empire. I asked the security chief to hold the medical power of attorney up to the camera. Thomas barely glanced at it before letting out a dry, professional laugh. He informed the officers that the document they were holding was a blatant forgery signed by a corrupt private physician who had not examined me in over a decade. Thomas did not stop there. Han immediately typed on his keyboard and sent a highly encrypted email directly to the security chief official ship terminal. He told the men to check their devices. Seconds later, the chief tablet chimed. Thomas had sent over the official notarized documents for my irrevocable corporate trust. He clearly explained that I was the sole legal entity with absolute financial and operational authority over my estate and the logistics firm. He explicitly clarified that Michael was merely a revocable employee with zero legal standing to override my movements or dictate my medical competency. The trust documents were ironclad and completely legally binding across all international waters. Thomas stared intensely through the camera, warning the security officers that if they attempted to remove a high-net-worth passenger based on a forged document, he would personally ensure the cruise line faced a massive federal lawsuit. The chief of security stared at the glowing screen of his tablet, carefully reading the strict legal terminology and the undeniable proof of my ultimate authority. The tension in the room shifted instantly. The 3 large men realized they had been entirely duped and manipulated by an arrogant man trying to use the ship protocol to handle his dirty work. The chief's rigid posture dissolved into profound embarrassment. He lowered the forged piece of paper and sincerely apologized for the intrusive interruption. He assured me that neither I nor my granddaughter would be bothered by ship security for the remainder of the voyage. He offered to send a team down to Michael's cabin to immediately detain him for presenting fraudulent legal documents to the captain. I raised my hand and instructed him to do absolutely nothing of the sort. I told the chief of security that I wanted Michael to feel completely and falsely secure in his pathetic little plan. I ordered the officers to return to their posts and pretend that the eviction was proceeding exactly as Michael had requested. Let him sit in his cramped room and celebrate a victory he never actually achieved. The chief nodded respectfully, understanding that he was witnessing a complex family reckoning that went far beyond cruise ship jurisdiction. The 3 men quietly backed out of the penthouse and closed the heavy door behind them, leaving Zariah and me in absolute peace. I returned to the sofa, picked up the storybook, and continued reading to my granddaughter, as if the disruption had never even occurred. Michael had played his hand believing a single piece of fake paper would neutralize me, but he had only succeeded in exposing the absolute depths of his desperation. After the security officers left the room, I walked back over to my laptop where Thomas was still waiting patiently on the video call. I thanked him for his swift intervention, noting that Michael's decision to weaponize a medical document was a new level of cowardly behavior. Thomas did not smile or share my sense of momentary victory. His face remained completely grim and deeply troubled. He leaned closer to the camera and told me that the confrontation with the ship's security team was merely a distraction from a much larger threat. Thomas revealed exactly why Michael had gone through the trouble of illegally obtaining that forged medical document in the first place. It was not just an impulsive tool to have me thrown off a luxury cruise ship. Thomas informed me that his ongoing forensic audit had just uncovered a massive property transfer filed in the county records exactly 2 days ago. Michael had used that exact same forged power of attorney to legally declare me incompetent back in Florida. Using that fabricated authority, my son had completely bypassed the standard legal protections of my estate. Thomas looked directly into the camera and delivered the crushing blow. He stated that Michael had illegally transferred the entire deed of my primary estate directly into Heather's name. They were not just trying to ruin my vacation, they were actively stealing the very roof over my head. I walked back into the master bedroom of the royal penthouse and checked on Zariah. She was sleeping soundly, curled up under the thick duvet, the rhythm of her breathing slow and steady, completely unaware of the massive storm brewing around her. I closed the door quietly, leaving her in absolute peace, and walked over to the mahogany wet bar. I poured myself a single glass of neat whiskey. I did not drink it immediately. I set the heavy crystal glass next to my laptop and pulled up the encrypted property records Thomas had just forwarded to my secure server. I scrolled through the dense legal filings, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted county transfer logs. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was staggering. Michael had not merely forged my signature to secure a temporary financial advantage. He had legally maneuvered to rip the very ground out from beneath my feet. The stamped dates on the fraudulent transfer aligned perfectly with the exact end date of their luxury Caribbean cruise. They were never planning to return to their suburban home. They intended to disembark the ship in 2 weeks' drive, directly to my estate, and use the local sheriff to formally evict me the moment they arrived with their forged papers. They wanted to throw a 70-year-old man onto the street, seize the property I built from nothing, and lock the custom iron gates behind him. The sheer mechanics of the plan required a chilling level of premeditation and an absolute absence of empathy. They had coordinated this theft for months, laughing at my dinner table, while actively sharpening the knife they intended to put in my back. I took a slow sip of the whiskey, letting the burn focus my mind. They believed they had executed a flawless corporate takeover of my personal life. I looked out the massive panoramic window at the dark ocean, my thoughts drifting back to my late wife, Barbara. Barbara was a woman of fierce intelligence and uncompromising intuition. She had grown up navigating the same harsh realities I had, and she possessed a remarkable ability to see right through the polished masks of opportunistic people. From the very first day Michael brought Heather home, Barbara had warned me about the dark ambition hiding behind her forced smiles. She saw the calculating gleam in Heather's eyes, the way she assessed the expensive art on our walls and the square footage of the estate before she even bothered to ask how our day was. Barbara told me on her deathbed that Heather would eventually try to strip the estate down to the copper wiring if given the chance. She made me promise to protect the legacy we built together. I honored that promise. I placed the entire estate, the corporate holdings, and every single liquid asset into an ironclad blind trust. I was the sole trustee, rendering the physical deed of the house utterly untouchable by standard power of attorney protocols. Michael and Heather were completely unaware of this deeply buried legal fortress. By forging my signature to transfer the property, Michael had not actually stolen the house. He had merely committed a highly documented federal felony for a piece of paper that held absolutely no legal weight. The deed transfer was entirely invalid, but the criminal act of filing it with the county clerk was irreversible. My son had handed me the exact weapon I needed to permanently destroy his freedom and his reputation. I set the empty whiskey glass down and opened the second encrypted folder Thomas had compiled. This file contained the raw forensic data from Michael's corporate logistics contracts over the past 3 years. As I cross-referenced the vendor payouts with our primary shipping manifests, a distinctly unnatural pattern began to emerge. Millions of dollars in corporate expansion funds were bleeding out through aggressively inflated consulting fees. I tracked the routing numbers directly to a private limited liability company, registered under a discrete shell corporation in Delaware. The entity was meticulously buried behind layers of legal jargon. A few more keystrokes and a deep dive into the corporate registry revealed the ultimate beneficiary of the shadow account. It belonged entirely to Gregory Heather's wealthy and incredibly arrogant father. The betrayal was not just a reckless act by a greedy son and his entitled wife. It was a highly coordinated multi-generational family theft. Gregory had been using his daughter's marriage to siphon massive monthly kickbacks from my life's work. They had systematically drained my corporate reserves to fund Gregory's failing real estate ventures, while Heather used the remaining cash to lease luxury vehicles and buy designer wardrobes. Michael was not a misguided executive making temporary mistakes. It was an active participant in a sophisticated racketeering scheme designed to enrich his white in-laws at my direct expense. The sheer disrespect of stealing from a black man who had fought tooth and nail for every single dollar he earned was a unique kind of poison. I felt a cold and absolute calm wash over me. I was no longer just dealing with an ungrateful son. I was dismantling an entire syndicate. As I reviewed the damning evidence of Gregory's kickbacks, a bright red security alert flashed across my laptop screen. The internal tracking software I personally coded decades ago notified me of an active, highly secure login attempt. Michael was currently connected to the ship's premium wireless network. He was frantically trying to access the offshore holding accounts from his cramped cabin. He had finally realized that Thomas was freezing the domestic credit lines and was desperately attempting to liquidate the remaining stolen assets to cover his tracks and secure a massive cash reserve before the authorities could intervene. I watched his digital footprint scramble across the server, attempting to initiate rapid wire transfers to untraceable accounts in the Cayman Islands. He was rushing, making sloppy mistakes, terrified of the closing walls. I did not call him to gloat. I did not send a warning. I simply accessed the Master Administrative Override panel and permanently revoked his security clearance credentials. With a single decisive keystroke, I locked him entirely out of the logistics server, instantly severing his connection to every single dime he thought he controlled. I initiated a hostile and total corporate freeze right from the middle of the ocean. Michael was now trapped on a luxury vessel with a useless laptop, zero liquid assets, and absolutely nowhere to run. The massive cruise ship docked at the vibrant port of Nassau early the next morning, blasting its heavy horn across the crystal blue waters. Down on the lower passenger decks, Michael and Heather were desperately trying to maintain their crumbling facade of immense wealth. They dressed in pristine designer resort wear, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that their corporate credit lines had been permanently severed the night before. Heather firmly gripped the hand of her biological son, Mason guiding him past the thousands of ordinary tourists crowding the exit ramps. She loudly reminded the surrounding passengers that her family was not taking a standard crowded bus tour. She boasted that Michael had secured an exclusive $3,000 private island helicopter excursion tailored specifically for high net worth executives. Michael walked closely behind her, his face tight with lingering anxiety from his failed attempt to access the offshore accounts. Hod mistakenly believed that since he had prepaid the helicopter reservation, using the corporate expansion fund 2 months ago, the excursion would proceed without a single issue. He assumed the physical distance from Florida would temporarily shield him from the absolute destruction I had unleashed upon his finances. They strutted down the gangway and walked directly toward the luxury aviation terminal, located at the edge of the bustling port, sneering at the locals. They expected to be greeted with chilled champagne and escorted directly to a private tarmac. Instead, they walked straight into the cold and uncompromising reality of a severely interrupted cash flow. The silent adjustment I initiated from my penthouse suite was actively spreading across international borders, hunting down every single asset they tried to claim as their own. Heather approached the polished mahogany desk of the luxury aviation terminal with an air of supreme and toxic entitlement. She slammed her gold-embossed boarding passes onto the counter, demanding immediate service and complaining loudly about the suffocating Bahamian heat. The sharply dressed tour operator scanned the barcodes on the passes and immediately frowned at the glaring red error message flashing across his terminal screen. He politely but firmly informed Heather that their exclusive VIP reservation had been automatically flagged and completely canceled exactly at midnight. He explained that the primary corporate logistics account tied to the original booking had been entirely frozen by a major federal fraud alert, rendering the tickets completely invalid. Heather shrieked in absolute indignation, demanding to speak to a regional manager and claiming it was a simple banking error made by incompetent staff. Michael rushed forward, sweating profusely through his expensive linen shirt, and desperately tried to hand the operator a different credit card from a secondary bank. The machine aggressively rejected that one as well, buzzing loudly and echoing in the quiet terminal. The operator maintained a strict professional distance, firmly stating that, without $3,000 in physical cash or a valid wire transfer, they were strictly prohibited from stepping onto the private tarmac. Stripped of their financial armor, Michael and Heather were promptly escorted out of the air-conditioned luxury terminal by local port security guards. They were forcefully directed back into the sweltering, overcrowded public tourist plaza. They stood stranded on the hot concrete, surrounded by thousands of noisy cruise passengers and aggressive street vendors. They had absolutely zero access to liquid cash. Their credit cards were useless pieces of plastic, and the stifling tropical humidity was rapidly ruining Heather's expensive designer outfit. The impenetrable fortress of wealth they had stolen from me was fully collapsing in broad daylight. The crushing reality of their sudden poverty ignited a vicious and ugly panic in Heather. As she frantically wiped the sweat from her forehead, her eyes darted across the crowded marina and locked onto the restricted private docks. I was walking peacefully down the wooden pier, holding Zariah by the hand. We were being escorted by a uniformed captain toward a sleek, beautifully maintained private yacht I had chartered and paid for in full a decade ago through a secure private trust. Zariah was laughing, pointing excitedly at the crystal-clear water, and completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding in the public plaza behind us. The sight of my black granddaughter receiving the exact luxury treatment Heather felt solely entitled to absolutely shattered the final remnants of her fragile sanity. Heather completely lost her composure. She shoved past a crowd of confused tourists stomping down the wooden pier, with her designer heels clicking aggressively against the planks. She marched directly into our path, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Michael trailed behind her, weakly begging her to stop and avoid another scene, but she was entirely beyond reason. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She hurled deeply racist and vitriolic insults, publicly blaming me for ruining her perfect life and humiliating her family in front of the world. She then turned her venomous gaze down to Zariah. Her voice echoed over the quiet marina as she viciously labeled my granddaughter a defective charity case, screaming that Zariah was nothing but a useless prop who never belonged in their pristine biological family. The wealthy facade she had maintained for years was completely gone, replaced by the ugly and venomous bigotry she had always harbored just beneath the surface. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic screaming. I did not take a single step backward or engage in a pathetic public shouting match. I stepped smoothly in front of Zariah, shielding her from the brunt of the verbal assault, and simply held up my smartphone. The camera lens was pointed directly at her face. I had quietly pressed the record button the exact moment I saw her storming down the pier. I stood in absolute silence, letting the device capture every single racist slur, every venomous insult, and every horrific admission of neglect, falling from her mouth in pristine high-definition video. Heather suddenly noticed the glowing red recording icon on my screen, and her furious screaming died instantly in her throat. The color drained from her flushed face as the terrifying realization crashed down upon her. She had just provided me with a publicly recorded, undeniable confession of her extreme psychological abuse. I lowered my phone and looked at her with a cold and calculating stare. I did not offer her a single word of rebuttal or anger. I turned around, gently guided Zariah onto the deck of the waiting private yacht, and signaled the captain to cast off. I now possessed the exact irrefutable evidence I needed to permanently strip Heather of her parental rights and absolutely destroy her in family court. As the private yacht glided smoothly across the vibrant turquoise water, putting significant physical distance between us and the sweltering public marina, I guided Zariah down into the air-conditioned luxury cabin below the main deck. I handed her a plate of fresh tropical fruit and assured her once again that she would never have to see or hear that vicious woman ever again. Once she was comfortable and completely occupied with a colorful animated movie on the cabin television, I walked back up to the shaded stern of the vessel. I pulled my smartphone from my tailored jacket pocket and immediately reviewed the high-definition video I had just captured on the crowded wooden pier. The recorded footage was absolutely pristine and undeniably damning. Heather's face was twisted in an ugly mask of unhinged bigotry as she screamed those horrific, unforgivable racist slurs about my 8-year-old granddaughter. Her own venomous words provided the exact legal ammunition I needed to permanently sever her ties to my family. I attached the heavy digital video file to a secure, highly encrypted message and sent it directly to Thomas back in Florida. I did not include any emotional commentary or expressions of anger in my message. I simply typed a strict and absolute legal directive. I ordered Thomas to immediately draft emergency permanent guardianship papers for Zariah. I explicitly instructed him to use the enclosed video as the primary foundational evidence of severe emotional abuse and profound parental unfitness. Heather had carelessly handed me the ultimate weapon to completely strip away her parental rights. She assumed her status as a wealthy suburban mother would shield her from any real consequences. She was about to learn that her artificial status meant absolutely nothing when confronted by a man willing to use his unlimited resources to protect his own blood. I knew the local family court system was notoriously sluggish, often dragging custody battles out for agonizing months or even years while allowing emotionally abusive parents to maintain joint access to vulnerable children. I was absolutely not going to allow Zariah to spend a single second lingering in a bureaucratic waiting room or facing a lengthy psychological evaluation. I picked up my phone again and dialed a highly private unlisted number I had saved in my contacts for over a decade. 3 years ago, when Michael and Heather initially filed the formal adoption paperwork for Zariah simply to boost their public charity image, their specific case was randomly assigned to a prominent family court judge. What my son and his deeply arrogant wife never realized was that this particular judge owed his entire political and judicial career directly to my quiet financial backing during his highly contested early campaigns. I had provided the logistical infrastructure and the silent capital necessary to secure his heavily disputed seat on the bench. I did not call him today to ask for an illegal favor or a shady backroom deal. I called him to demand a perfectly legal, heavily expedited review of emergency evidence. When the judge answered the phone, I bypassed all standard pleasantries and informed him that Thomas was currently filing an emergency injunction for permanent guardianship based on undeniable video evidence of racial abuse and child endangerment. I requested that he personally intercept the legal filing the exact moment it hit the county clerk system and place it at the very top of his immediate morning docket. The judge listened to the cold gravity in my voice, remembered exactly who built the foundation of his career, and agreed without a single moment of hesitation. Bureaucratic delays simply do not exist for men who know exactly which invisible levers to pull behind the heavy velvet curtains of the justice system. While I secured my granddaughter's absolute legal protection from the comfort of a private yacht, a completely different scene of frantic desperation was unfolding back on the massive luxury cruise ship. Michael and Heather had managed to retreat to their cramped cabin after being publicly humiliated and forcefully thrown out of the luxury aviation terminal. They were entirely stripped of physical cash, completely locked out of their corporate credit accounts, and facing a rapidly accumulating onboard bill they had absolutely no way to settle. Trapped in a state of sheer panic, Michael opened his travel laptop and made a catastrophic tactical error. Driven by his wife's relentless screaming and his own arrogant belief that he could still outsmart the system, he bypassed the standard domestic banking portals. He accessed a highly hidden, entirely illegal offshore account officially registered in the Cayman Islands. He had quietly skimmed small fractions of corporate profits into this shadow account for years, keeping it completely hidden from both the Internal Revenue Service and my internal corporate auditors. He genuinely believed it was his ultimate untraceable safety net. He urgently typed in the complex routing numbers, attempting to initiate an immediate wire transfer to cover their exorbitant ship expenses and secure emergency cash for their eventual return to Miami. What my son entirely failed to comprehend was that the exact moment I locked his administrative credentials on the corporate server the night before, I also embedded an aggressive tracking script directly into his specific machine. I had completely flagged his unique device address. He was operating under the foolish assumption that the cruise ship wireless network provided him with a secure cloak of international anonymity. Hun had no idea that every single keystroke he made was being actively monitored and logged by the security architecture I personally designed. The exact moment Michael hit the confirmation button to execute the illegal offshore wire transfer, he sealed his own absolute and undeniable destruction. The financial transaction did not go through smoothly, as he had desperately hoped. Instead, the aggressive tracking software I had installed immediately recognized the unauthorized interaction with a heavily sanctioned foreign tax haven. The system automatically triggered a massive, unavoidable corporate fraud alert across the entire logistics network. This was not a simple internal notification sent to Thomas or my local accounting team for a quiet review. The security protocol was permanently hardwired to comply with strict international trade regulations. The moment the illegal offshore routing numbers were verified, the automated software simultaneously transmitted the flagged transaction data, Michael's exact geolocation coordinates, and the complete financial history of the hidden Cayman Islands account directly to the federal banking authorities. Michael sat in his cramped cruise cabin, staring at a glaring red error screen, completely oblivious to the sheer magnitude of the trap he had just sprung on himself. In his arrogant rush to secure a few $1,000s to appease his furious wife, Michael had accidentally handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation undeniable probable cause on a solid silver platter. The quiet family dispute over stolen corporate expansion funds had just instantly escalated into a highly documented, inescapable federal tax evasion and wire fraud investigation. The tropical evening descended over the Caribbean, casting long and dark shadows across the private balcony of my royal penthouse. I was sitting quietly at the dining table, reviewing the confirmation emails from the family court judge regarding Zariah emergency guardianship, when a frantic and heavy pounding echoed against my cabin door. The urgent rhythm was completely devoid of the polite professionalism expected from the ship crew. I stood up, adjusting my suit jacket, and checked the digital security monitor mounted on the wall. Michael was standing in the hallway, completely ignoring the strict maritime privacy protocols he usually championed. He was breathing heavily, his knuckles raw from slamming against the reinforced wood. The arrogant and untouchable executive who had confidently ordered champagne in the dining room just a day ago was entirely gone. I was replaced by a terrified and desperate man who had finally realized the absolute magnitude of the trap closing around him. His expensive tailored shirt was soaked in cold sweat, clinging awkwardly to his chest, and his hair was in complete disarray. I unlocked the heavy door and pulled it open, allowing him to stumble into the pristine foyer. He did not shout or attempt to assert any false authority. He simply stood there, trembling, under the soft glow of the chandelier, looking like a cornered animal, realizing there was absolutely no escape from the cage. The federal banking alert triggered by his illegal offshore wire transfer had clearly reached him through a frantic notification from his shadow broker. The digital fortress he thought protected him had completely collapsed, and the sheer weight of the impending federal indictments had physically crushed his arrogant posture into absolute submission. I gestured for him to walk into the main living area, closing the door firmly behind him to seal him inside his own reckoning. Michael collapsed onto the plush velvet sofa, burying his face in his trembling hands, before looking up at me with deeply bloodshot eyes. He begged for an immediate family truce, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to reconstruct the shattered narrative of his innocence. He swore that the $50,000 he withdrew from the restricted corporate expansion fund was merely a temporary personal loan, fully intending to replace the capital before the next quarterly review. I then attempted to justify the fraudulent transfer of my primary estate deed, frantically claiming it was a highly sophisticated tax planning measure designed solely to protect my assets from future probate courts. I did not raise my voice or offer a single ounce of paternal sympathy. I walked over to the mahogany desk, picked up a thick stack of freshly printed financial documents Thomas had securely transmitted to me, and dropped them directly onto the glass coffee table in front of him. I systematically dismantled every single lie falling from his mouth. I pointed to the highlighted routing numbers, proving he had been quietly siphoning logistics profits into his hidden Cayman Islands account for over 3 years, long before this luxury vacation was even conceived. I showed him the precise legal nullification of his forged medical power of attorney, completely invalidating his pathetic excuse of proactive estate management. I laid out the exact paper trail, linking his stolen corporate funds directly to Heather, exorbitant country club memberships, and leased luxury vehicles. The printed bank statements were undeniable, heavily documented proof of his calculated corporate embezzlement and severe elder financial abuse. Michael stared at the cold and hard numbers scattered across the table, his final desperate excuses dying instantly in his throat as the undeniable reality of his impending federal prosecution washed over him. Stripped of his financial armor and completely cornered by the undeniable paper trail, Michael desperately sought a final and cowardly exit strategy. He looked at the bank statement, swallowed hard, and made the ultimate and unforgivable betrayal. He pointed a trembling finger at the documents and completely threw his wife under the proverbial bus to save his own skin. He claimed with a shaking voice that he never wanted to steal a single dime from the company I built. He vehemently insisted that Heather was the true criminal mastermind behind the entire systematic theft. Michael painted himself as a tragic and manipulated victim, stating that Heather had relentlessly demanded a lifestyle of extreme luxury that his standard executive salary could never possibly sustain. He told me that she had viciously threatened to file for divorce, ruin his public reputation, and take full custody of their biological son Mason if he did not find a way to continuously fund her extravagant vanity projects. He swore that the Shadow Limited Liability Company, receiving the corporate kickbacks, was entirely her father's creation, and that he was merely forced to facilitate the illegal transfers under severe emotional duress. He begged me to contact the federal authorities and offer him complete immunity, promising to testify against his wife and her wealthy father in open court to secure their immediate convictions. He reduced a decade of marriage to a simple transaction, entirely willing to send the mother of his child to a federal penitentiary if it meant he could maintain his freedom and his polished corporate title. The sheer depth of his cowardice was staggering. He possessed absolutely no loyalty to the woman he had stolen for, proving that his greed and self-preservation easily eclipsed any genuine human connection he claimed to hold. I stood silently in the center of the living room, listening to my son eagerly offer up his own wife as a sacrificial lamb to the federal justice system. I did not have to respond to his pathetic plea for immunity or offer any counter-arguments to his cowardly accusations. A slow and heavy click echoed through the quiet penthouse drawing. Michael panicked gaze away from the glass coffee table. The solid mahogany door of the master bedroom swung open, revealing Heather standing perfectly still in the doorframe. She had managed to bypass the distracted corridor stewards and sneak into my suite 20 minutes earlier, intending to confront me privately regarding her severely humiliated social standing at the aviation terminal. Instead of ambushing me, she had been trapped inside the bedroom, forced to stand in absolute silence while listening to her husband meticulously detail her corporate crimes and volunteer her for a lengthy federal prison sentence. The color was entirely drained from her face, replaced by a mask of pure and unadulterated fury. She stepped out into the living area, her hands clenched into tight fists, staring at the man who had just traded her freedom for his own. Michael scrambled backward against the velvet sofa, stammering incoherent apologies as his ultimate betrayal was laid bare in front of the very woman he tried to destroy. The fragile and arrogant alliance they had used to abandon an 8-year-old child and steal my life, work instantly vaporized. The two of them turned on each other viciously right in the middle of my suite. The air in the royal penthouse instantly turned completely toxic as Heather lunged toward Michael. She screamed at the top of her lungs, striking his chest with her fists while cursing him for trading her freedom to save his own pathetic executive career. Michael scrambled backward over the velvet sofa, raising his arms to block her furious blows, shouting that she was the one who forced him into embezzlement to fund her endless vanity projects. I stood entirely still, watching the violent collapse of their arrogant marriage. They had built their entire union on a foundation of unearned wealth and shallow entitlement, and the moment that money evaporated, they devoured each other like starving wolves. I did not raise my voice to intervene in their pathetic domestic dispute. I walked over to the heavy mahogany front door, pulled it wide open, and coldly instructed them to take their vicious argument out of my suite immediately. Michael tried to plead with me one last time, but Heather grabbed his arm and dragged him into the hallway, her face contorted in absolute rage. I shut the door firmly behind them, locking the deadbolt to secure my peace. Out in the corridor, Heather realized that her husband was utterly powerless and completely stripped of his corporate armor. Panicking, she pulled out her smartphone and utilized the expensive maritime satellite connection to place a frantic and tearful call to the mainland. She dialed her wealthy father Gregory, sobbing hysterically into the receiver. She begged the arrogant real estate developer to step in and fix the catastrophic situation, claiming I had gone completely insane and was trying to ruin their perfect family. She assumed her father's deep pockets could simply buy their way out of a federal investigation. Less than 20 minutes after I kicked my son and his wife out of my suite, the secure phone on my desk began to ring with an incoming international satellite call. I picked up the receiver and immediately recognized the booming and deeply condescending voice of Gregory on the other end of the line. Heather's father did not bother with formal greetings or basic human decency. He launched straight into an aggressive and unhinged tirade, treating me exactly the same way his daughter treated the service staff. He loudly demanded to know who I thought I was threatening to unleash his entire team of corporate defense attorneys to tie me up in crippling civil litigation for the next 2 decades. He swore he would drag my reputation through the mud and publicly paint me as a senile and bitter old man suffering from advanced dementia. He spoke with the blind and toxic confidence of a man who had never faced a single real consequence in his entire privileged life. Gregory then proudly boasted that my attempts to freeze my son's finances were completely irrelevant because he already held the ultimate trump card. He laughed cruelly through the static of the satellite connection, declaring that the primary deed to my sprawling Florida estate had already been successfully transferred into his daughter's name. He confidently stated that the massive property was legally hers and he fully intended to help her sell my home the moment the cruise ship docked in Miami to cover any resulting legal fees. He believed his arrogant words would strike terror into my heart and force me into immediate submission. He thought he was speaking to a defeated truck driver completely oblivious to the fact that he was actively threatening a man who spent 40 years dismantling hostile corporate syndicates. I allowed Gregory to finish his aggressive rant without interrupting him a single time. When his heavy breathing finally paused, I responded with a tone of absolute and freezing clarity. I calmly informed him that the impressive property transfer he was so fiercely bragging about was executed using a completely forged medical power of attorney. I stated clearly that my son illegally falsified my signature to bypass the county clerk protocols, elevating a simple real estate dispute into a highly documented federal crime. I explained that because my estate was securely locked inside an irrevocable blind trust, the fraudulent deed transfer held absolutely zero legal weight and had already been flagged by the authorities. I listened as the arrogant bluster in Gregory's voice faltered, but I did not stop there. I shifted the focus of the conversation directly to his own financial vulnerabilities. I informed him that my corporate attorney, Thomas, had just completed a massive forensic audit of Michael Logistics contracts over the past 3 years. I recited the exact registration numbers of the obscure shadow limited liability company Gregory had incorporated in Delaware. I listed the precise dollar amounts of the monthly corporate kickbacks he had been quietly receiving to prop up his failing real estate developments. I explained exactly how he had used his daughter's marriage to systematically siphon over $2 million from my hardworking employees to fund his golf club memberships and luxury investments. The aggressive volume of his voice completely vanished, replaced by the shaky and shallow breathing of a man realizing his entire financial fortress was constructed on quicksand. He had aggressively threatened my home, so I methodically and surgically dismantled the foundational integrity of his entire corporate existence right over the phone. The line fell into a heavy and suffocating silence. Gregory could not muster a single word of defense or offer another pathetic threat. His arrogant bravado completely evaporated into dead air as the terrifying reality of his exposure set in. He finally realized that the black man he had condescended to for years held the absolute power to systematically destroy his entire family legacy. Before he could attempt to negotiate a cowardly settlement or beg for financial mercy, I delivered the final and irreversible blow to his remaining freedom. I calmly informed him that Thomas had not simply gathered these corporate documents for a private family dispute. I stated clearly that my attorney had already formally submitted the comprehensive audit of his shadow company directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I told Gregory that he was now officially implicated in a massive multi-million-dollar federal tax evasion scheme, and the authorities were already reviewing the wire transfers he received from my son. I advised him to stop worrying about my Florida estate and start looking for a highly competent white-collar criminal defense attorney. I did not wait for his response. I firmly placed the receiver back onto the cradle, terminating the satellite connection and plunging his world into utter chaos. The entire syndicate was now actively bleeding out, but the war was far from over. The 16-day luxury cruise finally reached its unavoidable conclusion as the massive ship glided slowly into the bustling port of Miami just before dawn. The tropical humidity returned with a vengeance, seeping through the cracked balcony doors of the lower passenger decks. Inside their cramped and dimly lit cabin, the atmosphere between Michael and Heather was absolutely suffocating. They were no longer screaming at each other or hurling vicious accusations across the room. The explosive anger that followed Gregory's catastrophic phone call had burned itself out, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated terror. They packed their expensive designer clothes into their suitcases, intense and suffocating silence. Every zipper pull and rustling fabric echoed loudly in the small space. They firmly believed their only viable chance of survival was to disembark the vessel as quickly as humanly possible, rush back to their suburban fortress, and liquidate whatever physical assets they could find hidden in the house. They desperately needed immediate cash to hire high-powered white-collar defense attorneys before I could officially file the corporate and civil injunctions on the mainland. They still foolishly assumed the legal system moved at a sluggish and highly predictable pace. They were entirely unaware that I had already utilized my decades of carefully cultivated influence to bypass the standard bureaucratic delays. The heavy ship horn blasted a vibrating note across the water, signaling the official end of their 16-day nightmare. Michael grabbed the heavy luggage, and Heather gripped Mason tightly by his small hand. They were incredibly eager to flee, desperate to blend into the anonymity of the thousands of disembarking passengers. They marched out of their cabin without looking back, convincing themselves they could still salvage their shattered reputation if they simply beat me to the courthouse. Up in the pristine sanctuary of the royal penthouse, I did not share a single ounce of their frantic and desperate energy. I moved with the calm and highly deliberate pace of a man who had already secured his total and absolute victory. I had contacted my private aviation and logistics team on the mainland, arranging for a secure transport vehicle to meet Zariah and me at a designated VIP exit far away from the chaotic public terminals. I made absolutely sure my granddaughter was completely shielded from the ugly and traumatic reality of what was about to unfold down below. I left her happily eating a final breakfast pastry under the strict supervision of my personal security detail and walked out onto the private upper observation deck. I looked down at the massive concrete pier stretching out infinitely beneath the towering cruise ship. The main disembarkation ramp was a chaotic sea of thousands of sunburned and exhausted tourists, funneling slowly toward the Miami Customs Terminal. It did not take me long to spot Michael and Heather, aggressively pushing their way through the dense and noisy crowd. They were forcefully shoving their heavy leather luggage forward, gripping Mason tightly, their heads swiveling nervously as they scanned the immediate area for any sign of my presence. They looked exactly like terrified fugitives fleeing a massive crime scene. I stood perfectly still against the cold steel railing hidden from their line of sight, watching them march directly into the inescapable and highly coordinated trap I had meticulously laid for them days ago. The morning sun beat down on the concrete, highlighting the sheer panic radiating from their tense postures. They believed the physical distance from the ship would grant them safety, completely blind to the reality that my silent adjustment had already surrounded them. As Michael and Heather stepped off the steep metal ramp and onto the solid concrete of the Miami port, their tense shoulders visibly relaxed for a fleeting and pathetic second. They mistakenly believed they had successfully crossed the threshold into the safety of their home state. They were entirely wrong. Before they could even attempt to join the long and winding line for the primary customs checkpoint, a solid wall of dark blue uniforms materialized directly in their path. 4 heavily armed Miami Police Department officers stepped out from behind a thick concrete pillar, instantly and aggressively blocking their only escape route. Flanking the stern police officers was a severe-looking woman, wearing a sharp gray suit and holding a thick manila folder against her chest. She possessed the unmistakable, uncompromising posture of a senior investigator from the Department of Children and Families. Michael froze completely in his tracks, his eyes widening in pure shock as he dropped the handle of his expensive leather suitcase. It hit the concrete ground with a dull and heavy thud. Heather stumbled backward in her designer heels, her face turning a ghastly shade of white as the lead police officer placed a heavy hand squarely on Michael's chest to prevent him from taking another step forward. The surrounding crowd of tired vacationers immediately stopped moving, creating a wide and entirely silent circle around the unfolding public confrontation. The investigator stepped forward, holding up a certified court document bearing the official seal of the state of Florida. She looked directly into Heather's terrified eyes with absolute and undisguised disgust. She did not offer a polite greeting or pull them aside for a private conversation. She stood her ground in the center of the terminal, representing the full and undeniable weight of the justice system they thought they could so easily evade. The lead police officer did not lower his authoritative voice to spare them any ounce of public embarrassment. He loudly and clearly read Michael and Heather their Miranda rights, his deep voice echoing sharply off the cold concrete walls of the terminal. He announced that they were being placed under immediate arrest for felony child abandonment and severe criminal endangerment. Heather let out a guttural shriek of pure panic as two officers grabbed her arms, forcing them behind her back and locking heavy steel handcuffs securely around her wrists. Michael did not even attempt to resist or argue his innocence. He simply stared blankly at the ground as the cold metal snapped closed around his own wrists, his entire polished corporate identity instantly and permanently erased in front of hundreds of staring, whispering passengers. The senior investigator from Child Protective Services moved swiftly and gently during the chaotic and loud arrest. She knelt down and spoke softly to Mason, offering the frightened young boy a warm smile and a comforting hand. She carefully guided him away from his screaming mother and securely took him into temporary state custody. The profound visual of my arrogant daughter-in-law being dragged away in handcuffs while her biological son was legally removed from her physical presence was the absolute culmination of their unforgivable greed. The trap had fully snapped shut around them, but the ultimate and total destruction of their highly fabricated lives was only just beginning. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Miami Detention Center buzzed incessantly overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the thick concrete walls. Michael and Heather were immediately separated during standard processing, aggressively stripped of their expensive designer belts, flashy jewelry, and custom shoelaces. They were placed in cold individual holding cells alongside common criminals entirely isolated from the privileged suburban bubble they had so aggressively protected. The brutal reality of their completely ruined social standing finally began to set in as the heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening finality. Heather sat on a rigid metal bench, shivering uncontrollably in her ruined vacation dress, completely unable to comprehend that she could not simply demand to speak to a regional manager. She desperately requested a phone call to contact her private wealth banker, genuinely believing she could arrange an expedited wire transfer to secure an immediate release from the filthy precinct. The desk sergeant calmly informed her that every single one of her domestic and offshore accounts had returned a critical federal freeze code. She had absolutely zero access to the stolen corporate funds she had relied upon to fund her arrogance. Michael paced the narrow length of his tiny cell, his tailored resort shirt stained with sweat and sheer panic. He frantically calculated the exact timeline of the impending press leaks, utterly terrified that the board of directors would discover their chief executive officer was currently locked in a county jail for felony child abandonment. He had no cash, no valid credit cards, and absolutely no political allies left to exploit. The impenetrable financial fortress he thought he had successfully stolen from me was completely dismantled, leaving him entirely exposed to the unyielding consequences of the justice system. I did not leave the city to return to my estate just yet. I drove directly to the downtown police precinct, accompanied by my corporate attorney, Thomas. I had spent 40 years building a massive regional logistics empire, and over those long decades of fighting systemic barriers, I had carefully cultivated deep and quiet relationships with local and state officials. I utilized that precise political influence to completely bypass the standard visitation protocols and secure a private, unmonitored meeting in a secure interrogation room. 2 heavily armed guards escorted Michael into the small, windowless space. He looked completely broken and utterly defeated. The arrogant man who had casually sipped imported champagne and threatened to lock me in a state-run nursing home just 24 hours prior was entirely gone. Michael slumped heavily into the metal chair bolted to the floor, his hands cuffed tightly to the table. He immediately began weeping, thick tears of self-pity streaming down his face as he looked at me for salvation. He desperately begged me to post his required bail, claiming that the terrible conditions of the holding cell were unfairly destroying his mental health. He completely ignored the horrific trauma he had selfishly inflicted on my 8-year-old granddaughter. Instead, he frantically pleaded that he needed to be released immediately so he could return to the corporate headquarters and prevent the board of directors from initiating a swift vote of no confidence. He swore that if I just gave him access to the company treasury one last time, he would quietly resign and pay me back every single stolen dollar. I was entirely consumed by the desperate preservation of his shiny executive title, still foolishly believing that his corporate status was the most important issue at stake. I sat across the table from my son and maintained an expression of absolute and chilling neutrality. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic weeping pleas, nor did I offer a single ounce of paternal comfort to ease his mounting panic. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a single crisp piece of official corporate stationery. I placed the document flat on the scratched metal table and slowly slid it across the surface until it rested directly under his chained hands. Michael blinked away his pathetic tears and stared down at the paper, his breath catching painfully in his throat. It was not a bail receipt, a negotiated settlement agreement, or a promise of legal protection. It was a formal, irrevocable termination notice, bearing the official gold seal of the logistics corporation I built from the ground up with my own 2 hands. I calmly informed him that his lucrative employment as chief executive officer was permanently terminated effective immediately for gross financial misconduct and massive felony embezzlement. I explained that I had already convened an emergency virtual meeting with the executive board from the back of my secure transport vehicle while he was being booked. They had unanimously voted to strip him of all operational authority, seize his corporate shares to cover the stolen expansion funds, and permanently ban him from stepping foot on any company property. He stared at the termination letter in absolute horror, the final pillar of his fabricated identity collapsing right in front of his eyes. He had foolishly attempted to steal my entire legacy, and in response I had surgically removed his access to the only world that gave his empty life any actual meaning. Stripped of his wealth, his freedom, and his prestigious corporate title, Michael desperately searched for a final manipulative way to exploit my emotions. He leaned across the cold metal table, his voice cracking pitifully, and audaciously claimed that he had executed the property transfers and offshore accounts to honor the legacy of his late mother, Barbara. He swore he was only trying to protect the family assets exactly as she would have wanted him to do. That specific and calculated lie shattered my cold demeanor completely. I stood up slowly, towering over him in the cramped interrogation room. I looked down into his terrified eyes and informed him that I knew exactly what he did with his mother. Vintage diamond wedding ring. I revealed that my forensic audit had successfully tracked a highly suspicious and deeply insulting pawnshop transaction he made 6 months ago. I had secretly sold the incredibly precious family heirloom to purchase a gaudy designer watch for Heather's anniversary gift. The blood completely drained from his face as he realized his ultimate and most unforgivable betrayal had been fully uncovered. I told him that pawning the only physical memory I had left of my beloved wife to fund his arrogant lifestyle was a line he could never uncross. I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy steel door without a single ounce of hesitation. The silent adjustment was over. The absolute scorched earth protocol was now fully activated. The private transport from the Miami detention center took us directly to a secured airstrip where my company jet was already idling on the tarmac. I had successfully secured emergency temporary guardianship of both Zaria and Mason through the family court judge before the ink on my son arrest report was even dry. Mason was confused and quiet, holding his sister's hand tightly as we boarded the aircraft. He had just watched his parents dragged away in handcuffs, a trauma I deeply regretted he had to witness, but one that was entirely manufactured by their own unhinged greed. The flight back to our home city was smooth and silent. I arranged for my private security detail to meet us at the hangar and escort us straight to my sprawling estate. We bypassed the main roads to avoid any local press who might have caught wind of the high-profile arrest. When we pulled through the heavy iron gates of my property, my longtime housekeeper Dolores was already standing on the front porch waiting for us. Dolores had been with my family for nearly 30 years, and she loved those children fiercely. I walked Zaria and Mason up the stone steps and placed them directly into her capable hands. I instructed her to lock every door, activate the perimeter alarm system, and under no circumstances allow anyone onto the grounds without my explicit verbal authorization. She nodded grimly, wrapping her arms around the exhausted children and guiding them inside to the safety of the guest wing. Knowing they were finally secure behind the impenetrable walls of my estate, I turned back to my waiting vehicle. The personal family crisis was temporarily contained, but the corporate battlefield required my immediate and ruthless attention. I directed my driver to take me straight to the downtown glass high-rise that served as the primary headquarters for my logistics empire. When I stepped off the private executive elevator onto the top floor, the atmosphere was thick with absolute panic. The news of my son being arrested for felony child abandonment and the sudden freezing of our corporate expansion funds had already leaked to the upper management team. The massive glass-walled boardroom was in a state of complete and utter chaos. A dozen senior vice presidents and regional directors were shouting over each other, desperately trying to seize control of the rapidly deteriorating public narrative. Several of the younger executives Michael had recently promoted were pacing frantically, making hurried phone calls to crisis management firms and trying to figure out how to distance themselves from the impending federal indictments. They looked like starving vultures circling a dying animal, entirely focused on carving out their own survival rather than stabilizing the company I had built. They assumed the aging founder was happily retired and utterly oblivious to the internal corporate implosion. They thought they could use the sudden power vacuum to partition my legacy and enrich themselves before the federal authorities fully descended on the building. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching their pathetic display of disloyalty and greed. I did not announce my presence or demand their attention. I simply walked into the room, my hard leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The sound cut through their frantic shouting like a physical blade. One by one, the panicked executives noticed me and froze, their arrogant voices dying instantly in their throats as they realized the true master of the house had finally returned. I walked slowly and deliberately to the very head of the long mahogany table, the exact seat Michael had wrongfully claimed as his own. I sat down, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, and looked at the terrified faces surrounding me. I spoke quietly, but my voice carried the absolute and uncompromising authority of a man who had navigated brutal industry warfare long before most of them were even born. I informed them that the era of corporate embezzlement, inflated consulting fees, and gross negligence was permanently over. I pulled a meticulously organized list from my inner pocket, compiled directly from the forensic audit Thomas had finalized earlier that morning. I read off the names of 4 senior executives sitting in that very room. I explicitly detailed their quiet complicity in authorizing Michael fraudulent wire transfers and signing off on the illegal kickbacks routed to his wealthy father-in-law. I did not offer them generous severance packages or the dignified option to quietly resign. I fired every single one of them on the spot, stripping them of their security clearances and ordering them to vacate the building immediately. I warned them that if they attempted to contact the press or access the company's servers, I would hand their digital footprints directly to the federal investigators currently dismantling Michael offshore accounts. The remaining executives sat in terrified silence, fully grasping that the company had been instantly and ruthlessly purged of its toxic infection. In less than an hour, I had completely amputated the corrupt leadership and restored the structural integrity of my entire logistics network. The corporate bleeding was finally stopped, and absolute order was violently re-established under my direct command. I was just instructing the remaining management team on the immediate operational protocols when the heavy boardroom doors swung open violently. Thomas rushed into the room, completely ignoring the seated executives. His normally composed face was tight with severe urgency. He walked directly to the head of the table and leaned down to speak quietly into my ear. Thomas informed me that our carefully constructed holding pattern in Miami had just been aggressively breached. He'd revealed that Heather's wealthy father, Gregory, had managed to quickly liquidate an obscure asset and wire untraceable funds directly to a high-risk bail bondsman. The federal freeze on their known accounts had held firm, but Gregory had utilized a dark money channel we had not yet identified. Thomas stated that Heather had successfully posted bail and was immediately released from the detention center just 30 minutes ago. She did not hire a defense attorney or attempt to contact her husband, who was still rotting in a holding cell. Driven by pure spite and unhinged desperation, she had chartered a private jet and was currently en route to our home city. Thomas looked at me directly in the eyes and delivered the chilling warning. Heather was speeding straight toward my highly secured estate, firmly intending to forcefully breach the gates and physically remove Zariah and Mason before the ink on my temporary guardianship papers could permanently dry. The tires of a standard black SUV crunched aggressively against the gravel just outside the main wrought iron gates of my estate. It was a rideshare vehicle, a glaring downgrade from the leased luxury cars Heather usually paraded around in. She threw the passenger door open before the vehicle even came to a complete halt. She marched toward the gate, her expensive resort dress wrinkled from her time in the holding cell, her makeup smeared across her pale face. Flanking her were her parents. Gregory stepped out of the vehicle, looking absolutely livid, his face flushed with the toxic arrogance of a man who believed his wealth could bulldoze any obstacle. His wife followed closely behind, clutching her designer purse and glaring at my property as if she already owned it. Heather grabbed the heavy iron bars of my front gate and shook them violently. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding that I open the gate immediately and hand over her children. She shrieked that she was the sole legal owner of the estate, claiming her name was on the deed and that I was nothing more than a trespassing tenant. Her voice echoed sharply across the manicured lawns, dripping with the vicious racial entitlement she had hidden for years. She genuinely believed her father's dark money had bought her a permanent escape from the consequences of her felony child abandonment. She demanded the immediate surrender of Zariah and Mason, threatening to call the police to have me forcefully removed from the premises. I watched her unhinged display from the elevated position of my sprawling front porch. I did not move to open the gate. I simply watched her exhaust her fabricated authority, waiting for the perfect moment to execute the absolute nullification of her entire existence. I stood perfectly still on the top step of the porch, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that commanded the exact respect she sought to diminish. I was not alone to face her frantic tantrum. Standing firmly to my right was the county sheriff, a man I had known for over 2 decades through various community logistics initiatives. To my left stood the city master locksmith, a heavy canvas tool bag resting at his boots. He held up a heavy brass tumbler, the old locking mechanism from the main entrance, replaced just an hour prior. Heather stopped screaming and stared through the iron bars, her eyes darting frantically between the uniformed officer and the heavy brass lock glinting in the afternoon sun. She realized instantly that the perimeter of the estate had been completely secured against her. I walked slowly down the long stone pathway toward the gate, the sharp clicks of my leather shoes matching the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I pressed a button on my remote, allowing the heavy iron gates to swing open just enough to permit a face-to-face conversation. Gregory immediately lunged forward, puffing out his chest and attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me. He aggressively ordered the sheriff to arrest me for kidnapping and property theft, loudly boasting that his daughter held the absolute legal rights to the ground we were standing on. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. I looked directly into Gregory's eyes, matching his arrogant hostility with the cold, immovable resolve of a man who had survived corporate warfare against men far more dangerous than a corrupt real estate developer. I informed them both that they were standing on sovereign ground, governed by an irrevocable trust. Before Gregory could launch into another tirade of empty legal threats, Thomas stepped out from the shadow of the portico and walked smoothly to my side. My corporate attorney did not waste his breath on pleasantries or dramatic pauses. He pulled a crisp, heavily stamped document from his leather briefcase and held it directly in front of Heather's pale face. He announced with absolute legal clarity that he was holding a certified court order signed by a superior court judge exactly 20 minutes ago. Thomas explained that the medical power of attorney Michael, used to execute the property transfer, was a confirmed and highly documented forgery. Consequently, the judge had immediately and permanently nullified the fraudulent deed transfer. Thomas pointed directly to the bold red ink crossing out her name on the county registry printout. He stated clearly that Heather owned absolutely nothing. She possessed zero equity in the estate, zero legal standing to claim the property, and zero rights to enter the premises. The house belonged entirely to the blind trust I established decades ago, with my late wife, a legal fortress designed specifically to repel parasites just like her. Heather stared at the judge's signature, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. The invincible armor she thought her father had bought for her shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked back at Gregory, expecting him to unleash his high-priced lawyers or bark another terrifying threat to fix the situation. Instead, Gregory remained unusually quiet, his eyes locked on the official county seal. He finally comprehended that he could not bully or buy his way past a federal forgery nullification. The reality of their absolute defeat washed over the three of them, leaving them entirely stripped of their stolen power and completely exposed to the elements. I did not allow them a single moment to recover their composure. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a second legal document, handing it directly to Heather. I informed her that it was a formal and immediate eviction notice for the suburban mansion she lived in. Because that property was purchased entirely with stolen corporate expansion funds, the company had officially seized the asset. I told her she had exactly 1 hour to retrieve her personal clothing before my private security team physically locked down the perimeter. Heather crumpled the paper in her trembling hands, letting out a shattered, pathetic sob as she realized she was entirely homeless. Gregory stepped forward to grab her arm, intending to retreat to the waiting vehicle and flee the disastrous confrontation. As he turned his back, the county sheriff stepped directly into his path. The officer pulled a thick sealed envelope from his uniform jacket and pressed it firmly against Gregory's chest. The sheriff announced loudly that he was formally serving Gregory with a federal subpoena on behalf of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The document demanded his immediate appearance regarding the shadow limited liability company he used to receive illegal corporate kickbacks. Gregory dropped his hands to his sides, his face turning an ashen gray as the crushing weight of a federal tax evasion indictment paralyzed him. The entire corrupt family was utterly ruined, standing silently on my driveway as the consequences of their relentless greed swallowed them whole. I did not allow Heather the dignity of a quiet departure from the sprawling suburban mansion she had illegally maintained with my stolen corporate funds. While she was frantically throwing her designer clothing into a haphazard pile of suitcases, under the strict supervision of my private security detail, I initiated the next phase of the asset reclamation. I contacted the heavy equipment dispatch center of my logistics firm and ordered a specialized corporate towing team to her exact location. I monitored the operation through a live video feed provided by the lead security officer on the ground. Heather stumbled out of the front door, dragging 2 heavy bags, firmly expecting to load them into the pristine white luxury sports utility vehicle she had leased using the embezzled expansion capital. Instead, she was forced to stand completely frozen on the manicured lawn as 2 massive industrial tow trucks backed aggressively into her driveway. The operators did not ask for her permission or engage in any polite conversation. They swiftly secured thick steel chains to the axles of both her luxury vehicle and Michael's high-end imported sedan. Heather shrieked in absolute indignation, dropping her luggage onto the grass and waving her hands frantically as she threatened to call the police. The lead tow operator simply ignored her frantic outburst, presenting a certified corporate seizure manifest that legally authorized the immediate repossession of company property. The heavy hydraulic winches engaged with a loud mechanical grinding noise, dragging the pristine vehicles up onto the flatbeds. Heather was left standing entirely alone on the empty concrete driveway, clutching her designer handbag, as the physical symbols of her stolen status were hauled away into the afternoon traffic. She had absolutely no transportation, no home, and nowhere to run. With the physical assets of their fraudulent lifestyle thoroughly dismantled, I turned my attention to a deeply personal theft that required an immediate correction. I drove my truck directly into the affluent downtown commercial district, pulling up to the heavily fortified storefront of a high-end luxury pawnbroker. Thomas had successfully traced the serial numbers from my late wife's appraisal documents to this exact location. I walked through the reinforced glass doors and approached the impeccably dressed proprietor, placing my platinum corporate card on the glass counter. I demanded the immediate return of Barbara's vintage diamond wedding ring, a custom heirloom I had purchased decades ago during the very first profitable year of my logistics company. The broker nervously retrieved the velvet box from a secure backroom vault, confirming that Michael had sold it for a fraction of its true value just to purchase a gaudy anniversary watch for Heather. I paid the exorbitant recovery fee without a single moment of hesitation, securing the small box inside my jacket pocket. When I returned to the safety of my estate, I walked into the quiet study and opened the velvet lid. The diamond caught the late afternoon light, radiating the same quiet strength and uncompromising grace that Barbara had embodied every single day of her life. Michael had treated this sacred symbol of our enduring marriage as disposable currency, proving he possessed absolutely none of his mother's profound integrity. I looked out the window and watched Zariah playing peacefully in the garden with Mason. She possessed the same fierce resilience and deep, inherent kindness that defined Barbara. In that quiet moment of reflection, I realized with absolute certainty that Zariah was the only person in the entire world truly worthy of inheriting the ring. The fragile tranquility of my private study was suddenly shattered by the sharp ringing of my secure desk line. The automated voice of a federal telecommunications operator informed me that I was receiving a collect call from the Miami Metropolitan Detention Center. I accepted the charges knowing exactly who was waiting on the other end of the line. Michael's voice erupted through the speaker, frantic, irate, and completely unhinged. The humiliating reality of a cold jail cell had entirely broken whatever remained of his arrogant corporate persona. He did not call to offer a genuine apology or beg for my paternal forgiveness regarding the theft of his mother's wedding ring. Instead, he launched into a hysterical and vicious tirade about the ultimate betrayal he had just suffered at the hands of his own wife. He revealed that the exact moment Heather was released, on the dark money bail provided by her corrupt father, she immediately drove to a local bank branch, She used her remaining spousal authorization to completely drain their last surviving joint checking account, stealing the very last few $1,000s they had to their names. Furthermore, Michael sobbed uncontrollably as he confessed that Heather had not even bothered to contact a defense attorney for him. She had marched straight from the bank to a downtown law office and officially filed for a highly contested divorce. She served him the legal separation papers directly to his holding cell, formally abandoning him to face the federal fraud and felony child endangerment charges entirely alone. The woman he had sacrificed his family, his career, and his absolute freedom to please had discarded him the absolute second he was no longer a viable financial asset. Michael was now utterly isolated, completely stripped of his wealth, his marriage, and his fabricated executive invincibility. He paced frantically within the claustrophobic confines of his Miami holding cell, realizing with terrifying clarity that he was about to absorb the entire brutal impact of a massive federal indictment without a single ally in his corner. Driven by a desperate and raw survival instinct, my son suddenly stopped his pathetic weeping and shifted his tone to a cold, calculated negotiation. He knew I held the ultimate power to either crush him completely or offer him a minuscule sliver of mercy. Michael forcefully gripped the prison receiver and offered me an unprecedented and highly lucrative deal. He promised to formally turn state evidence and provide the federal authorities with a massive trove of hidden digital ledgers. He swore he could explicitly detail the entire architecture of Gregory's shadow limited liability company and decisively prove Heather's active complicity in the multi-million-dollar tax evasion scheme. He was entirely willing to testify against his vicious in-laws in open federal court and guarantee their absolute destruction. However, he laid down one desperate condition for his full cooperation. Hun demanded that I utilize my vast corporate resources to hire him a premium criminal defense lawyer to negotiate his plea deal and keep him out of a maximum security penitentiary. The ultimate scorched earth protocol was presented directly to me, completely shifting the entire landscape of the impending legal warfare. I instructed my pilot to prepare the company jet for an immediate return flight to southern Florida. I did not undertake this journey out of any lingering paternal affection or a sudden desire to rescue my son from the consequences of his own disastrous actions. I went because his desperate offer to dismantle his in-laws' criminal enterprise required my absolute physical presence to finalize the terms. The air conditioning in the Miami Metropolitan Detention Center visitation room was oppressively cold, smelling faintly of bleach and stale sweat. I sat at a scratched metal table, wearing a dark tailored suit, waiting in absolute silence as a guard escorted my son into the room. Michael shuffled through the heavy steel door, wearing a bright orange state-issued jumpsuit that hung loosely off his shoulders. He was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant executive who had aggressively ordered champagne in a crystal dining room just a few short days ago. The deep bags under his bloodshot eyes and his severely trembling hands revealed a man whose spirit had been completely crushed by the brutal reality of isolation. He sat down across from me, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the metal table, utterly incapable of looking me in the eye. He began to ramble, frantically repeating his offer to turn over every single digital ledger and shadow account password necessary to guarantee a federal conviction for his wife and her wealthy father. He begged me to secure him a competent lawyer to negotiate a plea deal with the federal prosecutors terrified of spending decades inside a maximum security penitentiary. I let him exhaust his pathetic bargaining pitch before I raised a single hand to silence him. I looked at the broken man sitting across from me and informed him that I would accept his proposition, but I would not be securing the services of a high-profile miracle worker. I told him I would hire a competent mid-level defense attorney, strictly tasked with keeping him out of a maximum security federal prison and securing a transfer to a minimum security facility in exchange for his full cooperation with the authorities. I made it explicitly clear that I was not buying his absolute freedom, only a slight mitigation of his well-deserved punishment. Michael nodded eagerly, tears welling in his eyes as he thanked me profusely for this microscopic sliver of mercy. I cut off his pathetic gratitude instantly. I leaned across the cold metal table and stated that my legal assistance came with an absolute non-negotiable condition that required his immediate compliance before my attorney would even look at his case file. I pulled a thick stack of certified legal documents from my leather briefcase and slid them across the table. I told him that his reckless greed and his wife's toxic bigotry had permanently disqualified them both from ever acting as guardians to any child. I demanded that he legally sever every single tie he possessed to the family he had so carelessly endangered. The price for my legal intervention was not money or corporate shares, but the complete and permanent relinquishment of his parental authority. He stared at the heavily stamped documents, his breathing turning ragged, as he finally understood the true cost of his survival. He had to trade the last remaining pieces of his personal life just to secure a basic defense lawyer. I instructed him to look specifically at the first two documents resting under his chained hands. I explained that the first contract was an irrevocable surrender of all his parental rights regarding Zara, granting me full and permanent legal custody of my granddaughter. I reminded him that he had allowed his wife to treat that brilliant little girl like a disposable piece of charity, and he had actively participated in abandoning her alone in a dark house. Hund had absolutely no right to ever claim her as his daughter again. The second document was a complete surrender of his parental rights to his biological son, Mason. I informed Michael that I would be stepping in as Mason's permanent legal guardian to completely protect the boy from the toxic and manipulative influence of his mother. I knew Heather would undoubtedly attempt to use her biological son as a pawn in her upcoming criminal trials, and I absolutely refused to let my grandson be weaponized by a desperate felon. Michael's hands shook violently as he picked up the pen provided by the guard. He choked on his own sobs, completely devastated by the reality of signing away his entire family. He tried to utter a weak apology, claiming he never meant for things to go this far, but his hollow words meant absolutely nothing to me. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name on every single designated line, legally erasing his status as a father. I calmly gathered the signed documents, verified his signatures, and placed them securely back into my briefcase. The transaction was complete, and the children were finally and permanently safe from his profound negligence. Michael lowered his head onto the metal table and wept openly, mourning the absolute destruction of his own life. I did not offer him a parting word of comfort or a false promise of future reconciliation. I simply stood up from my chair, signaled the heavy-set guard that our meeting was officially concluded, and walked out of the sterile visitation room without looking back a single time. I stepped out through the heavy security doors of the detention centers and walked into the blinding Florida sunlight, breathing in the fresh air of my newly secured family future. Before I could even reach my waiting transport vehicle, my secure mobile phone vibrated aggressively in my pocket. It was an urgent incoming call from Thomas. I answered the line expecting a routine update on the corporate restructuring efforts back home. Instead, Thomas delivered a frantic and highly alarming piece of intelligence. He informed me that the federal authorities had just unsealed the massive indictments against the Shadow Limited Liability Company. Heather had somehow been tipped off by an insider at her father's firm that her arrest warrant was being finalized. Realizing she was facing a severe federal prison sentence, she had completely abandoned her parents and her ongoing divorce proceedings. Thomas warned me that she had just emptied a secret offshore cash reserve and purchased a one-way first-class ticket to Europe, intending to flee the country in less than 2 hours. Heather realized with terrifying clarity that the federal indictments against her father's shadow company were about to be completely unsealed by the morning. She knew her dark money bail would absolutely not protect her from a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary once the sheer scale of the tax evasion scheme was made public. Stripped of her luxury vehicles and entirely abandoned by the husband she had just divorced in a holding cell, she threw a handful of designer clothes and every piece of expensive jewelry she could carry into a single leather duffel bag. She sprinted out of the cheap hotel room she had rented near the courthouse and flagged down a private town car, offering the driver a massive sum of hidden cash to break every single speed limit on the highway leading directly to the Miami International Airport. She was operating on pure adrenaline and sheer panic, constantly checking her reflection in the rearview mirror and jumping at the sound of every passing siren. She firmly believed that if she could simply cross the threshold of the international terminal and board a direct flight to Europe before the federal agents officially updated their active warrant database, she could completely escape the catastrophic consequences of her unhinged greed. She intended to vanish into a non-extradition country, leaving behind the absolute destruction she had caused to my family, her children, and her own parents. She leaned forward in the back seat of the speeding vehicle, clutching her freshly printed first-class ticket to Paris, entirely convinced that her inherited privilege would grant her one final and spectacular escape from the absolute crushing weight of the American justice system. Heather completely underestimated the vast technological infrastructure of the logistics empire she had so casually attempted to steal. The exact moment Thomas informed me of her frantic ticket purchase, I immediately accessed the central command server of my corporate dispatch center, right from my secured tablet. My company utilized a highly advanced proprietary fleet tracking software designed to monitor thousands of shipping vehicles across complex national supply chains in real time. I bypassed the standard commercial protocols and patched directly into the regional traffic camera grid using the heavy digital clearance I maintained for federal transport compliance. It took my security software less than 4 minutes to isolate the specific license plate of the private town car she had hired outside her hotel. I sat perfectly still in the back of my own transport vehicle, watching a glowing red dot move rapidly across the digital map of the Miami highway system. She was making a desperate high-speed run directly toward the international departures concourse. I did not bother calling her to negotiate a surrender or offer a pathetic warning. Instead, I established a direct, secure communication line with the chief of the airport police and the local office of the United States Marshal Service. I methodically fed them her exact geographical coordinates, her vehicle identification details, and her precise estimated time of arrival at the primary drop-off zone. I provided them with the explicit flight number and the departure gate she was frantically trying to reach. I effectively turned the entire metropolitan surveillance grid into a perfectly synchronized digital net, ensuring that every single law enforcement officer stationed at the airport was actively waiting for her before her car even reached the terminal entrance. Heather arrived at the bustling international terminal and practically sprinted through the sliding glass doors, keeping her head down and her oversized designer sunglasses firmly in place. She utilized a premium priority lane to bypass the massive crowds of ordinary travelers pushing her way to the front of the security checkpoint, with her usual toxic entitlement. Because the federal judge had not yet officially logged her updated flight risk status into the global security database, she managed to clear the standard screening process without triggering a single physical alarm. She grabbed her leather duffel bag off the conveyor belt and walked briskly through the sprawling duty-free concourse, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. She navigated the maze of high-end boutiques and crowded restaurants until she reached the secluded seating area of her specific departure gate for Paris. The large digital display above the desk indicated that boarding would commence in exactly 20 minutes. Believing she had successfully outsmarted the federal government and permanently evaded my retaliation, she let out a long, shuddering sigh of absolute relief. She walked over to an upscale terminal cafe, purchased an expensive iced coffee with her remaining hidden cash, and sat down in a plush leather lounge chair facing the massive runway windows. She crossed her legs and took a slow, victorious sip of her beverage, watching the heavy baggage carts load the aircraft that would carry her far away from her shattered life. She smirked quietly to herself, entirely confident that she had played her final desperate hand perfectly, completely oblivious to the silent and highly coordinated storm that was rapidly converging on her exact location. The quiet hum of the luxury boarding area was suddenly pierced by the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots marching purposefully across the polished terminal floor. Heather lowered her iced coffee and frowned, annoyed by the sudden disruption, until she realized the approaching figures were making a direct line for her specific lounge chair. 2 stern Transportation Security Administration officers flanked a tall, unsmiling federal marshal wearing a dark suit and carrying a thick steel clipboard. The marshal did not offer a polite greeting or ask for her permission to interrupt her morning. He stepped directly into her personal space and demanded she hand over her passport and her first-class boarding pass immediately. Heather froze completely, her arrogant smirk vanishing, as the marshal snatched the navy blue booklet directly from her trembling fingers. He loudly announced to the entire crowded boarding gate that her travel documents were permanently seized by the federal government. He grabbed her arm, pulled her out of the leather chair, and declared she was under immediate arrest for the federal crime of attempting to flee a jurisdiction to avoid massive felony prosecution. As the cold steel handcuffs violently clicked shut around her wrists for the second time in 24 hours, the marshal delivered the ultimate crushing blow. Han informed her that, because she was now a documented international flight risk, her previous bail agreement was entirely revoked, and she would be held in a maximum security federal facility without any possibility of release pending her trial. Exactly 3 months passed since the dramatic arrest at the international departure gate. During that time, the immense gears of the federal justice system ground forward with absolute and terrifying precision. Heather had been denied bail, entirely forced to sit in a maximum security holding facility, while her father Gregory frantically burned through his dwindling legal funds, attempting to delay the inevitable. The morning the federal trial finally convened, the atmosphere inside the downtown courthouse was incredibly dense. The gallery was completely packed with local journalists, former corporate executives, and curious spectators, eager to witness the highly publicized downfall of a prominent suburban dynasty. I arrived exactly 20 minutes early, bypassing the chaotic crowds gathered on the courthouse steps. I walked into the heavy oak-paneled courtroom and took my seat in the very front row. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, my posture rigid and completely unyielding. I sat in absolute silence, projecting the calm and undeniable authority of a man who had successfully navigated corporate warfare for 4 decades. I did not look back at the whispering crowd, nor did I flinch when the heavy side doors opened to admit the defendants. Heather and Gregory were led into the room, wearing standard-issue prison jumpsuits, their wrists heavily restrained by steel chains. The pristine designer wardrobes and the toxic aura of arrogant superiority they once wielded were entirely gone. They looked pale, exhausted, and profoundly terrified of the federal judge, staring down at them from the high bench. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, ready to personally deliver the final and devastating blow to the fragile foundation of their fraudulent empire. When the federal prosecutor formally called me to the witness stand, a heavy and suffocating silence fell over the entire packed courtroom. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the wooden enclosure with steady and deliberate steps. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, and sat down facing the jury box. I did not shout, weep, or display a single ounce of vengeful anger during my extensive testimony. Emotional outbursts are the tools of the desperate, and I was holding a mountain of irrefutable data. I answered the prosecutor's questions with the cold and methodical precision of a master logistician. I established a flawless and devastating timeline of their coordinated criminal activities. I provided the exact dates and routing numbers for the stolen corporate expansion funds, meticulously tracing the embezzled money directly into Gregory's hidden, limited liability company. I presented the forged medical power of attorney, detailing exactly how Michael and Heather had weaponized a fabricated dementia diagnosis to illegally transfer the deed of my primary estate. Finally, I addressed the horrific night of the luxury cruise departure. I entered the bright yellow sticky note into the official court record, calmly explaining how they had willfully abandoned an 8-year-old child, alone in a dark house simply to preserve their non-refundable vacation deposit. I supported every single claim with pristine bank statements, verified digital login credentials, and the high-definition video of Heather's racist rant on the Marina Pier. The 12 jurors watched me with absolute focus, their faces hardening with disgust as the true depth of the betrayal was laid bare. The sheer volume of hard paper evidence was an absolute guillotine, methodically dismantling every pathetic lie their expensive defense attorneys attempted to construct. The overwhelming weight of the prosecution's case left the defense completely paralyzed. After the closing arguments concluded, the federal jury was dismissed to the secure deliberation room. They were gone for less than 4 hours, a remarkably short window for a complex white-collar criminal trial. When the 12 jurors filed back into the heavy wooden box, the thick tension in the courtroom was incredibly palpable. Heather held her breath, her trembling hands tightly clasped together on the defense table, while Gregory stared blankly at the polished floor. The jury foreperson stood up and handed the official paperwork to the bailiff. The judge read the sweeping verdict aloud, his deep voice echoing sharply against the marble walls. Heather and Gregory were found guilty on multiple severe counts of federal wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and massive corporate tax evasion. Heather was additionally convicted of felony child endangerment and international flight to avoid prosecution. The judge did not demonstrate a single ounce of leniency during the immediate sentencing phase. He reprimanded them fiercely for their unhinged greed and their disgusting manipulation of vulnerable family members. He sentenced Gregory to 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary, ensuring the arrogant developer would spend the rest of his natural life behind thick steel bars. Heather received a staggering 12-year sentence in a federal women's correctional facility without any possibility of early parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with absolute finality. the immense wealth and toxic social standing they had relentlessly weaponized against my granddaughter had completely failed to shield them from the uncompromising reality of the justice system. Their fraudulent empire was permanently reduced to ash. Michael did not stand trial alongside his former wife and father-in-law. He had upheld his desperate end of our cold negotiation, serving as the primary star witness for the federal prosecution. He sat on the stand and detailed the inner workings of the Shadow Corporation, handing the government the exact keys required to lock his in-laws away. Because he provided such devastating state's evidence and surrendered all his parental rights to Zariah and Mason, the mid-level defense attorney I provided managed to secure his heavily negotiated plea deal. The judge sentenced Michael to 4 years in a minimum security federal work camp. It was a vastly reduced punishment compared to his co-conspirators, but it still represented the total loss of his executive career, his wealth, and his freedom. After the sentences were formally handed down, the armed federal marshals moved in to escort the prisoners out of the courtroom. As Michael was led past the wooden partition, his hands heavily chained to his waist, he stopped and looked directly at me sitting in the front row. The profound arrogance that once defined his entire existence was completely extinguished. He looked at me with deep, hollow regret and quietly mouthed the words, "I am sorry." I did not offer him a warm smile of forgiveness or a promise of future visitation. I simply looked at my broken son and nodded once, an absolute acknowledgement of his final surrender. The marshals pulled him through the heavy side doors, and the final toxic tie to my past was permanently and surgically severed. 6 months passed since the heavy wooden gavel fell and permanently shattered the toxic syndicate my son had tried to build. I completely immersed myself in the meticulous rebuilding of my regional logistics empire. I walked back into the downtown executive headquarters, not as a retired founder, but as the active and uncompromising chief executive officer. The sprawling glass boardroom was no longer filled with the entitled and corrupt sycophants Michael had surrounded himself with. I surgically removed every single manager who had turned a blind eye to his blatant corporate embezzlement. In their place, I promoted the loyal and fiercely hard-working employees who had spent years being aggressively passed over simply because they did not fit my former daughter-in-law, elite suburban aesthetic. I elevated the veteran warehouse directors and the brilliant fleet managers who actually understood the grueling mechanics of the supply chain. Under my renewed and steady hand, the company did not just recover from the massive financial bleeding. It thrived with an unprecedented level of absolute efficiency. The corporate expansion fund that Michael had selfishly drained to lease luxury vehicles was entirely replenished and actively utilized to open 3 new distribution hubs across the eastern seaboard. I spent my days negotiating hard contracts and my evenings reviewing pristine financial ledgers, ensuring that the structural integrity of my life work was completely bulletproof. The profound betrayal that had threatened to destroy my legacy was entirely neutralized by the relentless application of honest and dignified labor. I proved to the entire industry that my empire was not built on the fragile arrogance of inherited wealth, but on a foundation of absolute discipline that could never be dismantled by a greedy and ungrateful son. While the corporate headquarters experienced a massive and highly profitable resurgence, the most profound transformation occurred behind the heavy iron gates of my private estate. Zariah was finally flourishing in an environment entirely stripped of racial hostility and calculated neglect. The sprawling guest wing that Heather once threatened to bulldoze was completely redesigned into a bright and beautiful sanctuary tailored specifically to her vibrant personality. She was no longer treated as a disposable charity prop, trotted out for wealthy socialites or banished to a dark laundry room when she became inconvenient. She was the beloved and fiercely protected daughter of the house. I hired top-tier private tutors to nurture her brilliant mind and enrolled her in advanced piano lessons to foster her natural creativity. The grand estate was frequently filled with the joyful sound of her practicing complex classical melodies, a sound that entirely erased the lingering shadows of her previous trauma. She laughed freely and ran across the manicured lawns without the constant fear of being harshly reprimanded for simply existing. The deep anxiety that used to dictate her every movement completely evaporated under the steady and unconditional support of my household staff. I made absolutely sure she understood that her place in my family was permanent and completely irrevocable. She was surrounded by a solid wall of genuine affection, shielded entirely from the toxic bigotry her adoptive mother had inflicted upon her. Watching her thrive and reclaim her stolen childhood became the absolute greatest return on investment I had ever achieved. The terrified little girl who had called me in the middle of a thunderstorm was entirely gone, replaced by a confident and radiant child who finally knew her true worth. The healing process for my biological grandson required a vastly different and significantly more complex approach. Mason arrived at my estate carrying the heavy and deeply toxic psychological baggage meticulously installed by his mother. He had been taught a dangerous brand of racial entitlement and possessed a profound lack of empathy for anyone outside his immediate privilege. I immediately enrolled him in extensive and highly specialized behavioral therapy to actively deconstruct the bigoted worldview Heather had poisoned him with. I did not allow him to retreat into arrogant isolation or use his inherited status as a weapon against the household staff. I set firm and absolute boundaries, enforcing a strict regimen of accountability and mutual respect. Slowly and methodically, the angry and confused boy began to unlearn the horrific lessons of his early childhood. He started to recognize the severe emotional damage his parents had caused, and he actively sought to repair the fractured relationship with his sister. Under my constant and watchful guidance, he bonded deeply with Zariah. They spent hours together in the sprawling backyard, learning what true and unconditional sibling loyalty actually looked like. He stood by her side during her piano recitals and fiercely protected her peace when they ventured out into the city. He shed the toxic suburban armor his mother had draped over him and finally embraced the quiet strength of genuine humility. I watched them sit together on the wide front porch, reading books in the warm Florida sun, completely united by the shared trauma they had successfully overcome. I had managed to rescue my grandson from the exact same path of unhinged greed that had utterly destroyed his father, ensuring the destructive generational cycle was permanently broken. The quiet peace of our afternoon routine was pleasantly interrupted when a familiar black sedan pulled up the long gravel driveway. Thomas stepped out of the vehicle carrying a sleek leather briefcase and walked directly up the stone steps of the front porch. He did not bring alarming news of hidden offshore accounts or desperate appeals from federal holding cells. My chief corporate counsel arrived for a highly anticipated and incredibly final wrap-up meeting. He sat down at the heavy patio table and opened his briefcase with his usual surgical precision. Thomas produced a thick stack of certified legal documents bearing the fresh and undeniable stamps of the highest family court in the state. He placed the finalized permanent adoption and guardianship papers directly in front of me. I pulled my silver pen from my tailored jacket pocket and signed my name on every single designated line with absolute certainty. I officially and legally closed the dark door on the past. I handed the documents back to Thomas, simultaneously authorizing the immediate transfer of my entire logistics empire into a newly structured and utterly impenetrable, irrevocable trust. The entire fortune I had spent my life building was now legally secured and divided equally between Zariah and Mason. The vast wealth that Michael and Heather had so desperately tried to steal to fund their vanity was now completely locked away to guarantee the brilliant futures of the children they had so viciously discarded. I walked alongside Thomas down the winding stone pathways of my estate gardens, the dense Florida foliage providing a cooling shade against the afternoon heat. The heavy legal binders were securely locked inside his leather briefcase, officially sealing the future of my logistics empire and the absolute protection of my grandchildren. Thomas adjusted his glasses and noted the sheer magnitude of the wealth we had just permanently insulated from any future external threats. I stopped near the edge of the koi pond and looked at the man who had stood by my side through decades of corporate warfare. I told him that true wealth was never accurately measured by the bloated balance of offshore holding accounts or the superficial prestige of a chief executive title. I explained that the logistics company I built from a single rusted delivery van was merely a tool designed to generate opportunity. The actual legacy of a man is measured entirely by the uncompromising integrity of the people he leaves behind to inherit his work. I had spent 40 years fighting systemic barriers and ruthless competitors to build a fortress for my bloodline. I was absolutely unwilling to let that fortress be occupied by individuals who possess zero moral character. Thomas nodded in quiet agreement, recognizing that the monumental legal maneuvers of the past 6 months were never about preserving a financial hoard. They were about ensuring that Zariah and Mason would grow up, understanding that character cannot be purchased with stolen corporate expansion funds. I shook his hand firmly, thanking him for his unwavering loyalty, during the darkest crisis my family had ever faced. He turned and walked back toward his waiting vehicle, leaving me to fully absorb the profound weight of my secured victory. The absolute silence of my secured property stood in violent contrast to the current realities facing the architects of my attempted destruction. Heather was currently residing in a high-security federal women's penitentiary, completely stripped of her shimmering silver evening gowns and her toxic suburban entitlement. She was forced to wear a stiff khaki uniform and live her daily life dictated by the unforgiving blare of a heavily monitored cell block schedule. Her wealthy father, Gregory, occupied a similarly bleak concrete cell in a different facility, discovering that his aggressive real estate bravado meant absolutely nothing to federal prison guards. Michael was serving his reduced sentence at a minimum security work camp, spending his days performing grueling manual labor instead of aggressively ordering expensive champagne in crystal dining rooms. They had all operated under the deeply flawed assumption that unearned money equated to absolute invincibility. They genuinely believed their artificial social standing would automatically shield them from the severe consequences of felony child abandonment and massive corporate embezzlement. They underestimated the relentless machinery of the federal justice system and the absolute resolve of a father willing to scorch the earth to protect the innocent. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the miserable conditions they now endured. They had willingly traded their freedom and their family for the hollow pursuit of leased luxury vehicles and heavily mortgaged suburban mansions. They constructed a pathetic illusion of superiority that shattered the moment it was tested by genuine accountability. The rigid metal bars that now contained them were the direct and undeniable result of their own unhinged greed. They were erased from my daily existence, permanently exiled to the harsh institutional environments they completely deserved. I slowly walked back up the stone steps and settled into the comfortable leather chair on my sprawling back porch. The intense heat of the Florida afternoon was finally breaking, giving way to a gentle and cooling coastal breeze. The sky above the manicured tree line ignited in brilliant streaks of burnt orange and deep violet as the sun began its steady descent below the horizon. I looked through the open French doors leading into the main living room. Zaria and Mason were sitting together on the plush rug, deeply engaged in a complex and highly competitive board game. Mason rolled the dice and groaned in exaggerated defeat as his sister triumphantly moved her game piece across the board. Zaria let out a bright, unrestrained laugh that echoed beautifully through the quiet halls of the estate. It was a sound of pure and absolute safety. Mason smiled genuinely, completely stripped of the toxic arrogance his mother had tried to aggressively instill in him. They were no longer divided by biological status or subjected to the cruel racial hierarchies that Heather had attempted to enforce. They were simply a brother and a sister, finding joy in each other's company, under a roof where they were both equally cherished and fiercely protected. The deep psychological wounds inflicted by their parents were steadily healing, replaced by the sturdy foundation of mutual respect and unconditional familial loyalty. I watched them playfully argue over the rules of the game, their voices completely free of the terror that had consumed Zaria on the night she called me from the dark laundry room. The nightmare was officially over, replaced by a vibrant and enduring tranquility. I picked up my ceramic mug and took a long, slow sip of my bitter black coffee. The vivid colors of the Florida sunset faded into a deep indigo canvas, and the first bright stars began to pierce the darkening sky above the perimeter of my estate. I sat quietly in the comforting twilight and reflected on the sheer magnitude of the events that had transpired over the past 6 months. I did not execute this massive and total dismantling of my son's life out of a petty desire for emotional revenge. Vengeance is a chaotic and ultimately destructive pursuit that consumes the person seeking it. What I performed was a strictly necessary and heavily calculated structural adjustment to my legacy. As a man who spent his entire life building resilient corporate architecture, I easily recognized a critical and fatal flaw developing within the core of my own family. Michael and Heather were nothing more than rotting timber, threatening to collapse the entire house directly upon the heads of 2 incredibly innocent children. I simply extracted the compromised elements with absolute precision to ensure the foundation remained strong enough to endure for generations to come. I placed my mug down on the glass table and listened to the steady chirping of the evening cicadas, blending beautifully with the distant laughter of my grandchildren. My corporate empire was permanently secure. My family was entirely protected. My peace was absolute, and my silence was finally unbroken. I sit on the sprawling back porch of my estate, and reflect on the absolute most important lesson this entire ordeal has taught me. People often confuse silence with weakness. They assume that because a man does not scream or throw tantrums, he is incapable of defending himself. The real lesson I learned is that true power requires absolute restraint. When you possess the ability to completely destroy someone, you must also possess the discipline to wait for the exact right moment to strike. My son Michael and his wife Heather confused their unearned privilege with actual power. They believed that because they lived in a massive suburban house and drove luxury cars, they were completely invincible. They never understood that their entire lifestyle was a fragile structure built on stolen money and my silent tolerance. I learned that you cannot simply hand your children the keys to an empire and expect them to suddenly develop a moral compass. Integrity is not inherited through a bank account or a corporate title. It is forged through hard work and personal accountability. I gave Michael everything I never had growing up as a black man in a heavily segregated corporate world. I wanted to spare him the intense suffering I endured. Instead, I accidentally insulated him from the very struggles that build human character. He became weak, entitled, and entirely susceptible to the toxic greed of his wealthy in-laws. The lesson is that sometimes the most profound act of paternal love is allowing your child to face the absolute and devastating consequences of their own actions. Rescuing Michael from federal prison would have only reinforced his arrogant belief that rules do not apply to him. Letting him fall was the only way to force him to finally stand on his own 2 feet. Furthermore, I learned that family is an earned privilege, never an absolute right. We are conditioned by society to blindly forgive the horrific transgressions of our relatives simply because we share the same bloodline. Heather and Gregory operated under the racist and classist delusion that their social standing made them superior to my family. They treated my beautiful adopted granddaughter Zariah as a disposable charity project, using her to boost their public image, while subjecting her to severe emotional abuse behind closed doors. They weaponized their biological child, Mason attempting to raise him with the same toxic bigotry that infected their own hearts. I learned that protecting the vulnerable often requires you to aggressively sever the ties to your own flesh and blood. You cannot negotiate with a cancer. You must surgically remove it before it spreads to the healthy tissue. I chose to save my grandchildren over saving my son. I chose the innocent over the corrupt. Zaria and Mason are now thriving because I refuse to let biological loyalty blind me to the objective truth of Michael and Heather, profound cruelty. The cycle of generational trauma and unearned entitlement is permanently broken under my roof. I have structured my entire legacy to ensure that these 2 children will grow up understanding the immense weight of personal responsibility. They will inherit my wealth, but only after they have proven they possess the absolute moral fortitude to manage every single dollar wisely and with profound integrity. I am dedicating the remaining years of my life to ensuring they completely understand that true success is entirely built upon genuine compassion and unbreakable honor. I hope my journey gives you the courage to stand up against the manipulation in your own life. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found any value in my experience, please let me know which city or country you are watching from in the comments below. Have you ever had to make an incredibly difficult decision to protect your peace and cut off toxic family members? Share your own stories of silent adjustments and reclaim dignity. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can continue bringing you more powerful stories of survival and justice. Your continued support means everything to me. Stay strong, protect your boundaries, and